From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. December 28, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Bischoff gets historic NBC deal. WCW files lawsuit against WWF over wrestling with shadows, more. By Observer staff. In the biggest wrestling deal made in this country in recent years, Eric Bischoff put together a deal with NBC TV to begin airing 2-hour primetime wrestling telecasts beginning on February 14th, with a show live from the MGM Garden Arena in Las Vegas and a second show that will be broadcast live head-to-head with the WWF's WrestleMania on March 28th. The deal had been in negotiations for at least 2 weeks and was finalized this past weekend. Little is known about the deal at press time other than it was for multiple specials, starting at either 8 or 9 p.m. Eastern Time, the first of which will, not so coincidentally, be put on head-to-head with the WWF's St. Valentine's Day Massacre pay-per-view show, which is coming from Memphis. While no other dates for other shows are finalized, or even if the deal extends past 2 shows, it is believed that tentatively it does, but ratings will determine the final answer. The idea that these specials will often or even always go head-to-head with WWF pay-per-view shows would not be an uneducated guess. Although nothing is official, one would also suspect that the deal will speed up the return of both Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage to WCW, as no doubt the Hogan name would mean more to NBC officials than any other name in pro wrestling, and thus was probably used to close the deal. In addition, NBC TV is scheduled to get heavily into using pro wrestling as a cross-promotional vehicle, using many of its biggest TV stars on the inaugural show, including Matthew Perry of Friends. Hogan has again become a valuable commodity in the wrestling world because Fox has also been interested in starting its own primetime weekly wrestling series, and was hopeful of beginning in February, and there were tons of internal rumors in the profession that it would try and build its series around Hogan. WCW's plan is to bring Hogan back into the picture, most likely at the January 4th Georgia Dome show, where it would first be advertised as if it was his farewell appearance. As speculated here from the start, it is apparent the entire chasm between Hogan, Bischoff and Nash was a work on everyone, and at least Hogan and Bischoff's falling out over the Nash decision was simply a publicity stunt for Hogan, who was going to leave due to movie commitments anyway, and possibly a way to up the morale of the rest of the wrestlers. There is nothing in the booking plans for the first show since the deal was just made, but I would suspect, taking logical progression and politics into account, and God knows that speculating along those lines with WCW is beyond foolish, the February 14th show would be either build up to for the 3/28 show, or be headlined outright by the first Hogan vs. Goldberg match since the July 6th Georgia Dome show. Fox was interested in owning its wrestling organization outright, but without Hogan's name value, it would be almost impossible to start a new wrestling company from scratch with 2 established giants having locked up nearly all the top marketable talent. The ownership outright would on paper appear to be a stumbling block in what people had often figured was a natural relationship between WWF and Fox, being that both Vince McMahon and Rupert Murdoch are such bitter enemies of Ted Turner. But at this point, if Fox really wants pro wrestling in prime time to be successful, at least short term, starting a new company from scratch without established stars under the best of circumstances would take years to become profitable. There may be no other alternative. The first modern-era NBC/Pro Wrestling connection began in 1985, with the WWF Saturday Night's main event shows. The shows routinely drew huge ratings for once every month or 2 specials that aired as replacements for Saturday Night Live, generally drawing better ratings than SNL. The debut show on May 11, 1985, taped the previous night from the Nassau Coliseum with a Hulk Hogan vs. Bob Orton main event, drew an 8.8 rating. The shows grew in popularity, peaking with an 11.6 rating for a show that aired on March 14, 1987, featuring a battle royal that included both Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant, building up to their WrestleMania match 15 days later, a rating that was and remains to this day the highest-rated broadcast of a television show in that time slot on a Saturday night. This led to the first primetime pro wrestling broadcast in 33 years on February 5, 1988, live from Indianapolis, with a Hogan vs. Andre rematch from their famous WrestleMania match, which drew a 15.2 rating and 33 million viewers, making it the most-watched pro wrestling match ever in the United States. In the late 40s through 1955, pro wrestling was a staple of early prime-time network television, peaking when at one point there were prime-time wrestling telecasts 4 nights per week on every network during the heyday of the likes of Gorgeous George, who from a mainstream standpoint during his truly hot period in that in 1949 he was considered the biggest television star in the country. a status neither Hulk Hogan nor Steve Austin have ever approached, was the biggest celebrity this industry ever created, although from a longevity standpoint his drawing power and popularity can't be compared with Hogan. It has been said that Gorgeous George was responsible for selling more television sets, when they were a luxury item, than anyone during that period. 4 more primetime main events aired on NBC, 3 of which were to shoot the big angles for the WrestleMania shows from 1989 to 91, with ratings dwindling each time. The NBC/WWF relationship ended after 28 specials on April 27, 1991, when a Saturday night broadcast drew a rating far lower than SNL was doing at the time and the lowest rating of all the specials, in the wake of the WWF's exploitation of the Persian Gulf War angle with Hulk Hogan and Sergeant Slaughter, which also led to the company's attempt to break its famous Pontiac Silverdome record in the even larger Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum having to be moved indoors due to a poor advance. There had been an unwritten agreement between WWF and WCW, largely made by the cable industry in the late 80s, when both companies would put free television specials on against the other group's pay-per-view shows. The cable industry, which felt it was losing out on millions of dollars of potential pay-per-view revenue from both sides due to the rival group putting on free specials, which started on January 24, 1988, when the WWF created the Royal Rumble as a free USA Network special going against WCW's first-ever national pay-per-view, a disastrous bunkhouse stampede. This actually came on the heels of WCW announcing its first-ever pay-per-view, Starrcade 87 from Chicago on Thanksgiving night. WWF, which firmly established itself as the premier wrestling organization coming off the ultra-successful WrestleMania 3, created the Survivor Series on the same night and basically gave the cable companies the ultimatum of taking one show or the other, as they refused to offer the show to any company that aired the WCW show. With WCW unproven nationally and WWF coming off a huge success, nearly every pay-per-view company in the country wouldn't air the WCW show. It was limited to a few WCW strongholds like Charlotte, and a few cable companies, like the company here in San Jose, which basically gave up the show that would have given them more revenue on the principal issue of not wanting to be bullied around and not reneging on their initial commitment to WCW. Jim Crockett Jr. was counting on a huge pay-per-view windfall to pay off the debts he was piling up with his huge contracts. And when that didn't materialize, and because companies wouldn't air the show, this largely contributed to his near bankruptcy and forced the selling of JCP to Ted Turner in November of 1988. While still owned by Crockett, but with the help of Turner, who the cable networks had gone to put on a show when McMahon tried to eliminate the middleman and increase his cut of the pay-per-view shows, WCW scheduled a pay-per-view show called Clash of the Champions on March 27, 1988 from Greensboro, headlined by Ric Flair vs. Sting the same day as WWF's WrestleMania at Trump Plaza. Virtually the entire cable universe, which went with McMahon a few months earlier against Crockett, was this time siding with Crockett to break McMahon. After a lot of protest about censorship, McMahon ultimately gave in on financial issues that this game was all about, and the companies agreed to air Mania, again leaving Crockett out in the cold. Turner, feeling used by the cable industry, decided to air the planned pay-per-view as a live TV special, and after the show did a phenomenal 5.6 rating on TBS, Clash became a quarterly special. On April 2, 1989, WCW, owned by this point by Turner, again scheduled a Clash head-up with WrestleMania. It was at this point, when the buy rates for Mania for 2 straight years was well below its 1987 records, that the cable industry stepped in and basically decreed none of this would go on again. WCW had seriously talked of doing TNT or TBS specials head up to WrestleMania last year, but it never materialized, as the makeup of the cable industry had changed and those in charge had no knowledge of what went on nearly a decade earlier. To a peripheral fan, it would seem like one of the biggest upsets in martial arts history. But in reality it was simply confirmation of an age-old saying, time stands still for no man. Royce Gracie, the winner of 3 of the first 4 UFC tournaments, fell victim to a clock choke in approximately 5 minutes, losing a submissions-only match to Valide Ismail on December 17, in a makeshift arena on the beach in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, before what was described as a huge crowd to see Gracie's first-ever high-profile match in his native country. The loss for Gracie, who had turned 32 a few days earlier, was even more embarrassing for both himself, his side of the Gracie family and his supporters, since even though it was not a VALE TUDO rules match and Gracie family members have lost under sport jiu-jitsu rules from time to time, it was a match in which he set up the rules to his benefit and basically handpicked his opponent for weaknesses to exploit under those rules. Gracie had not competed since going to a now legendary draw with Ken Shamrock on April 7, 1995 in Charlotte, North Carolina. Since that time, In magazine columns and interviews, he continually knocked the skill level of the competitors who had succeeded him in being the top names in UFC, knocked Shamrock for fighting for a draw in that fight, while watching from the sidelines, almost with the attitude of the king watching the peasants fight. Many blamed this supposed public attitude on his older brother Rorion, his manager, who exuded this attitude from even before UFC began, and who actually brought the UFC concept to Semaphore Entertainment Group in 1993 and was part owner of the show during its infancy period. Rorion used ROYCE's 11 straight victories over what really amounted to a group mainly of stand-up fighters with no ground technique, and a few far less experienced ground fighters to create a business empire and a family and business myth about the ultimate and unbeatable fighting system where size isn't even a factor. And in doing so, completely changed the world of martial arts and pro wrestling forever, with the former having to acknowledge grappling is a lot closer to real fighting than the useless katas taught in Taekwondo academies, and the latter, particularly in Japan, relying more on chokes and armbars that the public realized were unspectacular, but real-life finishers. Behind the scenes, while not doing anything to actually fix outcomes of fights, Rorion did exert pressure at times to keep certain people out of the competition, most notably after an inexperienced but powerful Kimo gave ROYCE such a hard fight that ROYCE won but was beaten up so badly in the process he was knocked ROYCE out of a tournament. While publicly claiming ROYCE went into the tournament ill, instead of trying to set up a rematch to remove the chink from ROYCE's reputation, Rorion pressured Semaphore Entertainment Group to keep from bringing the charismatic Kimo back. After a stronger Shamrock, who GRACIE choked out in 2 minutes in the very first UFC on November 12, 1993, and thus considered him a very muscular powerhouse American hero type who would make a great victim for a return performance, had learned enough to go to a 36-06 stalemate with GRACIE, bloodying him badly in the process. At a time when UFC had no judging, Rorion GRACIE, realizing the game was catching up, pulled his meal ticket out. Shamrock constantly campaigned for a third match, including getting investors to put up $500,000 and for Rorion to put up another $500,000 for a winner-take-all pay-per-view match. And at the meeting where they were to iron out the rules, Rorion said his side couldn't afford the $500,000. While publicly GRACIE Jiu-Jitsu in its teachings tried to propagate the myth that ROYCE, who weighed between 180 to 185 for his wins generally over larger men, was living proof that size didn't matter against superior technique, privately they knew better, that the odds are against a smaller man unless he was far superior in either strength, athletic ability, skill, guts and/or conditioning. He would only agree to fight Shamrock again if he would get down to 90 kilograms, 198 pounds. During this same period, Bob Merowitz bought all the UFC stock away from Art Davie and Rorion GRACIE and became sole owner. GRACIE bowed out of UFC, at first to get married, but never came back, publicly complaining about the payoffs, the introduction of time limits and later judges, claiming that being a smaller man, he would need more time to use his defense and conditioning to wear out the bigger man before winning. ROYCE from most accounts had been wanting to fight over the past 3.5 years, but Rorion was reluctant to risk his financial empire and family myth. He shockingly was scheduled for a much-publicized return to fighting against powerhouse Mark Kerr for KRS in Japan early this year, and pulled out due to a serious back injury which required surgery. Many in martial arts were skeptical, although the injury and surgery were real, feeling that Kerr was the worst possible opponent. While there was a chance GRACIE could catch him in a submission, the odds were against it, and given the styles of the two fighters, it would be almost impossible, barring hitting the home run, for GRACIE to look good in the ring against such a powerful and skilled opponent. At best he could turn it into a boring defensive struggle. Eventually ROYCE agreed to return to fighting on December 17, publicly challenging any member of the Carlson GRACIE team. Carlson GRACIE is the younger brother of Elio GRACIE, whose father, Carlos GRACIE, created this family dynasty after learning jiu-jitsu from the Japanese at the turn of the century. Elio, who stormed out of the building at the finish of the match in Brazil, is ROYCE's father, who was at 140 pounds, a legendary fighter in Brazil in the 30s and 40s who only lost twice via submission in his career, once to eventual pro wrestler Masahiko Kimura of Rikidozen fame, the other match in the 50s, when he was 53 years old in a match that went something like 5 hours before the younger man broke his arm when Elio refused to tap. The younger Carlson fought the man who beat Elio and avenged GRACIE family honor by beating him and then claiming the title as the greatest fighter in the world. But the two brothers then feuded over who is really the god of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The idea was for ROYCE to do a tune-up submission-only match to test his recovery from back surgery, before fighting Kerr under VALE TUDO rules in Japan sometime next year. Mario Sperry, the current heavyweight world champion in the sport version of BJJ, accepted, but somehow by this time, the fight with Ismail had been set up. Ismail, 30, a short bulked-up natural 155-pounder who weighs in the low 180s, was successful years ago in the sport of BJJ and in the more primitive days of VALE TUDO for his point-getting ability in passing the guard and as a really tough little guy as evidenced by his ears. But he fell victim to the problem that faces all tough or talented little guys. His weighing too much for his frame didn't work against him as much in the sport of BJJ, because of the short time limits in the sport, but it did as he was soundly beaten in his two most publicized MMA matches, one to Yoshiki Takahashi at UFC, and more recently at the KRS Tokyo Dome show on October 11 by Akira Shoji. In both cases, his lack of conditioning saw him completely out of gas by the 10 minutes mark and he was a sitting duck for punishment from that point on. Royce's side insisted on no scoring system and no time limit, figuring Ismail had a big name, but stylistically he'd be easy prey in a no time limit environment. From several live reports, the fight can be simply described. Both men were cautious early. GRACIE took Ismail down, and at that point Ismail started gaining confidence, realizing almost immediately upon lockup that GRACIE wasn't what his myth stated he was. Ismail outmaneuvered him at every turn, with several reports saying that GRACIE was making blue belt-like mistakes from using a style that was described as being years out of date. Ismail himself was said to be shocked when GRACIE gave up his back, and he was able to execute a clock choke, a relatively new maneuver that some thought Royce, with his expertise in 80s style, may have known nothing about and certainly wasn't ready for. The maneuver is basically that Ismail was at GRACIE's side and was able to from that position, wrap his own gi around his throat and turn in a wrestling sit-out type maneuver to twist the gi around the throat in a choke. A stunned Royce wriggled around trying to fight the choke, and in doing so, only made it the grip tighter. He still refused to tap, and the ref, apparently afraid of a controversial stoppage, did nothing even though it was evident Royce was unconscious. Finally Horian threw in the towel and Royce remained unconscious for about 1 minute on the mat, and it was momentarily a very scary situation. The ease of the victory was such that even Ismail himself after the match was downplaying what will no doubt be his most publicized achievement of his career. He admitted going into the fight with little training and being worried about his lack of conditioning, but was relieved once they started locking up and were on the mat, saying Royce's skill was of a blue belt level and that any current black belt in Brazil would have beaten him. The latest in the legal morass between WWF and WCW was a lawsuit filed earlier this month as it regards the recently aired and generally highly acclaimed movie, Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows. WCW filed a suit asking for in excess of $3 million in a Stamford, Connecticut court for restraint of trade against Titan Sports Incorporated. In the lawsuit, WCW claims WWF went out of its way to stop High Road Productions in Canada from releasing its documentary, and in doing so kept Turner Broadcasting and WCW from attempting to acquire the rights to the movie. In a story detailed in these pages months ago and was the subject in even more detail in the cover story of the December 5 to 21st issue of the Weekly Hollywood Reporter, Turner Broadcasting attempted to buy all U.S. rights to this movie, hoping to release it first as a pay-per-view movie, then as a primetime television special on TBS or TNT where it would undoubtedly do great ratings since it would be heavily publicized on the wrestling shows, and Warner Home Video, a sister company, would distribute the movie to video stores. The story of this lawsuit and how the movie almost didn't get out is nearly as strange as the story itself the movie covered. The WWF signed a deal in the summer of 1996 with the WWF and with Hart that they would cover 1 year in the life of Hart to create a movie. There was no time frame in the contract, but the understanding while making the movie is the wrestling footage and movie would climax at SummerSlam when Hart captured the WWF title. The original plan was for Hart to win the title from Shawn Michaels months earlier at WrestleMania, but that's an old story. In return for a movie publicizing the behind-the-scenes of the WWF, with a gentleman's agreement to not show any footage of Steve Austin or Undertaker breaking character, but everyone else was fair game, WWF would supply High Road with all footage requested of its product, and in particular, Hart's career both in and out of the ring. The contract also stipulated the WWF would have all its performers and the company signed privacy release forms so they could appear in documentary form. In return, the WWF was to receive a $30,000 sum, plus a percentage of the eventual profits. Hart himself was also to be monetarily compensated for the making of the movie, but had determined that his share would all go to charity. The movie had finished shooting everything except family scenes, as the movie was originally going to be a behind-the-scenes look at a unique family consumed by wrestling and its most famous offspring. Hart was uneasy in the early going, fearing the movie would expose the business, but as time wore on, he began trusting the crew and in particular director Paul J. more and more, and came to the opinion a true story that would show just how skilled wrestlers are at their craft, how hard they work, the dangers, and the lifestyle, as opposed to one of the numerous silly exposes, would in the long run be a positive for the industry. The last wrestling filming was done at SummerSlam of 1997, although they did cutaways and used an interview that gave the impression they were in Madison Square Garden for the Raw episode in late September, until Hart, sensing a climax to the movie and a happy ending, suggested they follow him again and end the movie with his goodbye speech on Raw. After Montreal changed everything, the WWF demanded High Road turn over all its footage shot in Montreal. High Road refused, citing its contractual rights and also because Hart himself, who had no creative control of the finished product, refused to consent to that request. WWF refused any cooperation from that point forward, despite the contract, nor did they return the privacy release forms. Eventually, after months of unreturned phone calls, it became a legal issue, and in a conference call, Ed Kaufman, the WWF's chief legal counsel, and Linda McMahon conceded that by contract, they were obligated to turn over all requested materials, but even after that, nothing had changed. The belief is that WWF stopped cooperating because it may have gotten wind of Turner's interest in the movie. When High Road reached a deadline for needing the release forms, McMahon made a proposal. The WWF would supply all material needed and the release forms, and give up its cut of the royalties as well, on the condition that there could be no direct financial involvement regarding the movie with Turner. This nixed the potential Turner deal, but also went so far as to the point that High Road would not be allowed to advertise the video on any Turner networks, nor would A&E, which eventually bought the American broadcast rights, be allowed to advertise the special on any Turner networks. High Road agreed to the terms, feeling the alternative, a lengthy court fight with the WWF, which their legal counsel told them they would win millions of dollars in the long run but would probably hold up a release of the movie for several years. David Ostraker, one of the producers, in the Hollywood Reporter story conceded that High Road may have been naive for not taking the advice of its lawyers and going to court, but simply they wanted the movie out. There was nothing legally preventing WCW from hyping the movie on its own, but that was a decision made by Eric Bischoff to not have the announcers or anyone on television acknowledge the movie either before or after, because he felt the portrayal of McMahon in the movie was too close to his television character, and thus he felt the movie would help WWF. The fact the movie makes Hart into a bigger star and thus helps WCW apparently wasn't as important. The only mention, in vague terms by Gene Okerlund during a Hart interview on Nitro, was something against company directives. In St. Louis for Nitro on December 21, Hart was there, and Bischoff, not wanting the movie to either be addressed on the air or obviously ignored either by omission, felt it was best for Hart to not even appear on television and canceled his interview. There is also a valid business reason behind this decision as opposed to the on-the-surface idea that the movie makes a bigger star out of Hart and makes him in the long run far more worthy of the multi-million-dollar investment the company has in him. At this point, only one company has made a bona fide offer for video distribution of the movie, ironically being Titan Sports, no doubt much to the chagrin of Hart. At this point no deal has been signed. There's even the chance Titan could buy those rights basically to then tank the distribution, as most feel the movie could become very popular as a video rental. In the Hollywood Reporter story, Kaufman indicated that WWF was content with the finished product with a few exceptions. I saw the film and had some concerns, which were conveyed to High Road, but otherwise, it was fair. The concerns are two scenes: the scene of Hart and McMahon's conversation excerpts being played while Hart was wired, which McMahon was unaware of until seeing a preview copy of the movie in which he attempted to get removed, and the footage of a shaken McMahon emerging from the dressing room after taking the punch. So there is logic in the idea of Bischoff not wanting to hype a movie that if a deal is signed that looks at this point very possible to happen, his competition would benefit from financially. Not hyping the movie as a means to make the Turner restraint of trade lawsuits stronger doesn't appear to be a main reason, but it was probably also among the reasons. The WWF also never acknowledged the movie on television either before or after its airing. The movie on A&E drew a 2.2 rating, a rating described as very strong for A&E in prime time, but short of sensational. The 2.8 rating that A&E's History Special on Pro Wrestling did in April was one of the network's highest-rated shows of the year. The movie continued getting almost all favorable reviews over the past week. Most newspapers that rated it with stars on the 4 stars movie system gave it 3.5 stars, which is a tremendous rating. The only negative review we're aware of came from the Los Angeles Times movie reviewer Michael Lucas, who gave it a thumbs down, saying he didn't like the way the movie finished. Well, sometimes reality will do that to you. Ironically, in the same paper 2 days earlier, it got a strong positive review in the sports section by Houston Mitchell, a longtime Observer subscriber, who wrote that, for those of you like my wife, who laugh at pro wrestling and can't understand why anyone would ever spend 5 minutes watching it, do yourself a favor and tune into this program. You might not walk away a wrestling fan, but you will walk away impressed. And next time, you might not laugh so loud. The San Diego Union Tribune gave it what would amount to a thumbs in the middle, 2 stars, with a review believing the entire movie was just an elaborate wrestling angle. The Minneapolis Tribune, addressing that issue, stated, knocking the idea it was a wrestling angle by saying, if it's acting, it means he, Hart, could teach Robert De Niro a few lessons. A movie review in the Daily Hollywood Reporter called it an emotionally affecting documentary on career, patriotism and loyalty, and it's all the more astonishing because of its subject, professional wrestling. The review was completely positive except for saying the documentary attempted to cover too many angles and sometimes lost momentum focusing on peripheral issues. Chuck Finder, a Pittsburgh Post-Gazette sportswriter, wrote, "We never thought we'd write about A&E, let alone professional wrestling, before praising the flick." The Chicago Tribune wrote, "Temptation is to hail Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows, as one of the best and most surprisingly resonant documentaries you will see, no matter whether you savor or savage pro wrestling." TV writer Steve Johnson then considered that the movie could be an elaborate crock, saying he wouldn't put any level of fraud past Vince McMahon, but then went on to say about Hart that, "You have to conclude that nobody, not even a pro wrestler, is that good of an actor." His conclusion as it relates to Bret Hart, the WCW wrestling character, as opposed to Bret Hart the person, was kind of interesting. By taking part in this movie and revealing himself as more than a hastily drawn Hulk, Hart not only will test how complex fans really want their wrestlers to be, he also risks regaining some of the fan loyalty he thought he had sacrificed. The PANCRASE's promotion entree into the VALE TUDO world was the selling point behind its December 19th pay-per-view show, which was witnessed by fighters from many rival organizations, and was also the first PANCRASE event with Luthez in attendance. The reports from Japan were that it was a so-so show, and couldn't compare with the K1 Big Show the previous week. The live attendance was announced at 6,380, but looked to be closer to 4,000 in the 7,000-seat Tokyo Bay NK Hall. Masakatsu Funaki beat John Renkin, a Phyllis Lee charge from Peoria, Illinois in 5:55 when the referee stopped the match when Funaki was pounding on his face from the mount with punches and headbutts into the final of 3 VALE TUDO rules matches. Funaki, who in his reincarnation as a great real submission fighter has almost made nearly everyone forget his past, a protege of the New Japan Dojo at around the same time period as the likes of Keiji Muto, Chris Benoit, Jushin Liger, and Shinya Hashimoto, who was thought to have more potential in the ring as a pro wrestler than any of the above, is attempting to be pushed for a big money match next year with Hicks and Gracie. Funaki after the win talked of a potential match between the two of them, although I'm skeptical this will ever materialize. In the main event on the show, Guy Mesder of Lions Den retained his King of Pancrase title for the second time, winning his 3rd straight decision after going 30 minutes with Yuki Kondo. Mesder won the title winning an easy decision over Funaki in April, and retained it in September with another one-sided decision over Ryushi Yanagisawa. This match was closer, at least on the scorecard, with Mesder winning a majority decision, 30-28, 29-28 and 30-30. The fight was a long tactical fight which saw Kondo bleeding from above the nose, containing both standing and ground fighting. In what was said to be the most entertaining match on the show, Evan Tanner of Amarillo, a current USWF heavyweight champion who debuts in UFC on January 8, defeated Yanagisawa in 2:24 with a shoulderlock submission. In the other 2 VALE TUDO rules matches, John LeBay went to a 15-minute draw with Pancrase rookie and former college rugby star Kengo Watanabe, in his first match with such limited rules, and Keiichiro Yamamiya, also in his first match VALE TUDO style, went to a 15-minute draw with Jeremy Horn. LeBay and Horn were the 2 most recent opponents for Frank Shamrock in UFC middleweight title matches. The rules of these matches were no judging in the event they went the time limit. The only report we got is that Watanabe probably would have won the decision over LeBay had there been judges. The decline of former star Minoru Suzuki continued on the undercard, as he was carried out on a stretcher after his right knee was blown out in just 2:31 in a match against Asami Shibuya. Besides Thez, also in attendance at the show were Masahito Kakihara, All Japan, Enson Inoue, Shudo, and Hiromitsu Kanehara, rings. Kakihara and Kanehara were there mainly to see the opener, where Minoru Toyonaga of the Takata Dojo had an interpromotional match of sorts against Pancrase rookie Daisuke Ishii, with Ishii winning a unanimous decision after 10 minutes. Takata himself did not attend the show to be in Toyonaga's corner. The television ratings on December 21st remained the same story, despite WCW returning Ric Flair to action and playing before the largest live gate in company history at the TWA Dome in St. Louis. It is clear that at this point, the WWF's action-adventure sports entertainment storylines with some short wrestling matches thrown in, building to one main event, is destroying the stale WCW wrestling product. The return of Flair, no matter how pathetic the storyline from the previous week was one of those performances of a lifetime that Flair pulls out of the bag every so often. It's been said before by a lot of people that he is the single greatest all-around performer in the history of this industry. If you ask longtime followers of the game, his name will be listed first more than any others. Anyway, at the age of 49, he proved it one more time. But while Flair led to WCW actually winning one quarter hour and coming close with another, in the grand scheme of things the hotshot angle, complete with its own brand of swearing, may have popped the St. Louis crowd big and may have even helped the buy rate for Starrcade, but WCW overall is trailing more than ever to the much sleazier and more cleverly written WWF product. Overall, Raw had 4,850,000 viewers to Nitro's 4,483,000 viewers. From a rating standpoint, Raw did a 4.71 rating, 4.43 first hour, 5.00 seconds hour, and 7.1 share to Nitro's 3.99 rating, 4.67 first hour, 3.77 seconds hour, 3.58 third hour, and 6.0 share. If you compare the 2 hours and 5 minutes head-to-head, Raw drew a 4.71 rating to Nitro's 3.65. Main event segment comparison saw Raw's Triple H and X-Pac vs. Rock and Test doing a 5.12 final quarter and a 5.80 overrun. WCW with Goldberg, who is fading fast because WCW failed to stick with the formula against Hall, did a 3.95 rating for its 7-minute overrun, but that stat is totally misleading because it had 2 minutes to go unopposed at the end, so without those 2 minutes you are talking probably closer to a realistic head-to-head 3.4. Raw peaked from a quarter-hour standpoint with a 5.4 for the Shane McMahon vs. Mankind, the climax of the Mark Henry sexual chocolate angle with Jacqueline and Terry Runnels with the D'Lo Brown handicap match against Headbangers, as background music. Its low point was a 4.0 for the opening segment with the DX argument with the Shane McMahon-led corporation, which lost to Nitro's 4.2 for the first Flair Angle and Wrath vs. Lizmark Jr. match. Nitro fell as low as a 3.2 for the finish of Mysterio Jr. vs. Guerrero, ironically by far the best match on either show, which got killed by Raw's 4.9 for Shamrock vs. Gunn, and Hawk's fingering draws as the WWF drug pusher. The 2 quarters with the second Flair Angle drew 4.2 and 4.1, while Raw concurrently did a 4.4, Blackman vs. Blazer Jarrett, and 4.7 Road Dogg vs. Bossman and more of Mark Henry in sexual bondage. Over the head-to-head period, Raw won in males 18 to 24 with 358,000 viewers to 288,000. Nitro won with males 25 to 54 with 1,309,000 viewers to 1,247,000, and with males 55 plus with 359,000 to 343,000. Raw won with females 18 to 24 with 285,000 to 225,000. With females 25 to 54 with 686,000 to 587,000, but Nitro killed with females 55 plus with 481,000 to 152,000. Ages 2 to 11 saw Raw with 785,000 viewers to Nitro's 537,000. It should be noted by leaps and bounds, the most watched program among kids 2 to 11 this past week was Thunder with 915,000 viewers, a 25% jump over the norm, which corresponds with a large drop in adults for this past Thursday and evens out to the same number they always get. And whatever that means, that in both directions is probably all due to the heart attack angle, and Raw drew 994,000 teenagers while Nitro drew 438,000. For total adult viewing head-to-head, Nitro had 3,249,000, and Raw had 3,071,000, so even in a week where Raw killed, if you take away the teenagers, there really is no gap. Japanese television rundown. November 8th, All Japan. 1. Giant Baba and Jinsei Shinzaki and Masamichi Marufuji beat Yoshinobu Kanemaru and Gedo and Jado in 16-16. This match was edited down to 7 minutes. When Baba was in, it was brutal, but it also got the most crowd reaction. Kanemaru is a very good worker, but he's really small in a big man's company. There was one good comedy spot where Baba held Gedo in a full Nelson,
and Geto went for the Masachino behind the back low blow kick 3 or 4 times, but since Geto is so short and Baba so tall, he never could reach his groin with the kick.
Marufuji is a 19-year-old former high school wrestling champ who totally reminds me of Misawa in 1983. You can already see he's got awesome potential, the most of anyone since Jun Akiyama started. Shinzaki pinned Kanemaru with a praying power bomb. 1 3/4 stars. 2. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao beat Yoshihiro Takayama and Masahito Kakihara in 15:05. Kawada and Kakihara are great, so they covered for the other two, who actually both looked better than usual. Kawada and Kakihara turned it up and it was a real good match, ending when Tao pinned Takayama with the Nadawa. 3.5 stars. November 15th, All Japan. 1. Stan Hansen and Vader beat Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa in 7:10.
This was Hansen and Vader's first match in, well, technically second since they did the Tokyo Dome match in May, and it was a basic squash.
Hansen didn't work well with Ogawa. Vader started slow but got real aggressive as the match wore on.
Vader ended up pinning Misawa after a stuffed powerbomb and the Vader bomb.
Misawa and Ogawa did a good job putting the two over. 2 stars. 2.
Kawada and Tao beat Headhunters at 8:38 when Tao pinned B after the Nadawa.
B has lost a lot of weight, but unfortunately, I found most of it. These teams didn't work together well at all.
That's the problem with the real agile fat guys in wrestling, is when they get older, they seem to slow down a lot quicker.
1/2 star. November 28th, New Japan. 1. Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Koji Kanemoto beat Jushin Liger and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Kendo Kashin in 16:14. Final 9 minutes aired. Crowd was hard, but the work was its usual great level, maybe a tad below their standard. Kashin used a stone cold stunner to zero reaction.
Wagner did one of the coolest chicken wing submissions ever on Kanemoto at one point for a rope break spot.
Another cool spot saw Takaiwa no-sell a superplex off the top by Wagner, and then as he was posing to the crowd, Wagner took him down in a la magistral for a near fall.
Takaiwa ended up winning Wagner after 2 Death Valley bombs and a clothesline. 3 3/4 stars.
2. NWO Sting and Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Big Titan beat Tadao Yasuda and Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in 11:43 when Sting pinned Yamazaki after a clothesline off the top rope. Titan is terrible. 1/2 star. 3. In a tag tourney match, Shinya Hashimoto and Tatsumi Fujinami beat Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi in 16:05. Final 10 minutes aired. Hashimoto is packing on a little too much tonnage. He's starting to resemble Buddy Rose. Guess we know who is playing Santa at the New Japan Christmas party. He still did his wicked kicks. Turned into a good match with Hashimoto pinning Nagata after a DDT, a spinning heel kick and a sick-looking implant DDT. 3 1/4 stars. 4.
Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka beat Keiji Muto and Satoshi Kojima in another tag tourney match in 14:56. Muto was in a lot of the way and didn't do a whole lot.
Kojima looked good, and particularly had great chemistry with Tenryu. In many ways, Kojima is a younger version of Tenryu in that they both work stiff, have a lot of fire and brutality and not a lot of fancy moves. Tenryu ended up pinning Muto after a power bomb. 2 3/4 stars. December 5th, New Japan. 1.
Takaiwa and Kanemoto beat Liger and El Samurai in 14:37.
Second half aired on television.
Takaiwa and Samurai looked real good and Liger looked good, but Kanemoto was a little off.
Samurai is another of the most underrated workers in the business. Liger at one point did a pescado on Takaiwa, who caught him and slammed him on the floor. Finish saw Takaiwa turn Samurai inside out with a clothesline and Kanemoto pinned him with a tiger suplex.
3.5 stars.
2. NWO Sting and Hiro Saito and Muto beat Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto and Koshinaka in 14:25. Only the last 4:30 aired. Sting's got world-class gyno. Saito pinned Ohara after a German suplex. 1.5 stars. 3.
Tenzan and Kojima beat Nakanishi and Nagata in 14:52 when Tenzan pinned Nagata after a diving headbutt. Early in the match they teased problems with Tenzan and Kojima, but at the end they got along and shook hands after. Work was decent but it never really got going. 2 1/4 stars. 4. Sasaki and Yamazaki beat Hashimoto and Fujinami in a tournament match in 16:07. Almost the entire match consisted of Yamazaki getting destroyed. He just took punishment, which in a sense made it go nowhere, but since Hashimoto's offense can be brutal, it wasn't bad. You kept expecting him to make a hot tag and it really never happened. Finally, in one of those desperation spots out of nowhere, Yamazaki caught a kick and snapped Hashimoto's ankle, then put him in an ankle lock for the submission. It was one of those storylines for a match that probably sounded a lot better in the dressing room before they went out there than played for the crowd. 2.25 stars. Mexico. The last major week of wrestling in Mexico turned out to be totally anticlimactic. A few notes about politics and how things work. Univision and Galavision are actually in bed with each other, so there is no political problem from a television network standpoint in that vein if wrestlers on the WWF show on Univision were to also appear on Galavision. Univision and Telemundo are the big rivals, so wrestlers on Telemundo, which WCW is negotiating with, appearing on Galavision constitutes a TV political problem. The final show of the year at Arena Mexico on December 18th was headlined by Dr. Wagner Jr. and Blue Panther and Black Warrior capturing the CMLL Trios titles in the tournament final, beating Zumbito and Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. in what local newspapers were reporting was the best technical match at Arena Mexico in months. Most interesting because it matched uphill teams. Ovaciones rated the match a 10. The other top match saw Leo del Santo and Felino and Negro Casas beat Villanos Tercero and 5 and Silver King, focused on Casas ripping up the mask of V3. Casas at the show finally admitted that he had signed a WWF contract, and then proceeded to no-show his main event match on December 20th at Arena Coliseo. Dandy, who was to oppose Casas in the trio's main event, also no-showed the card. It is said that WCW has sent Paco Alonso a contract, but with Alonso on vacation, he hadn't seen it as of the weekend. On December 15th at Arena Coliseo, they had a triangular hair versus hair match with Ringo Mendoza, Tony Rivera and Halcón Negro Jr., which ended up with Negro getting shaved. Veteran El Signo, real name Antonio Sanchez, 43, was in very rough shape and having difficulty breathing according to early newspaper reports, but by the end of the week he was considered out of serious danger. AAA gave out the following awards at its 1998 year-end party. Rudo Wrestler of the Year was Kickboxer. Technico Wrestler of the Year was Octagon. Referee of the Year was Tirantes. He drew more money than almost all the wrestlers this year. Most hated was Sangre Chicana and most popular was Pero Aguayo Sr. Most hated woman was Miss Janeth and most popular was Alda Moreno. Rudo Relevos, 4-man teams, were of course the Vipers, and Technico team were the Juniors. The team was Pentagon and Abismo Negro, and face team were Pero and Pero Jr. EMLL on Christmas will be introducing a new character called Mr. Hoy, named after the Mexican version of the Today Show called Hoy, whose producers are wrestling fans. He will be accompanied by actor Alfredo Adame for his debut match. They had a one-night 16-man losers advance hair tournament in Naucalpan on December 20th. One of the men involved, Pirata Morgan, showed up with a do-rag, and when it was pulled off, it was shown he was bald. He had just lost another hair match this week. The commission threw him out of the tournament and put Bombero Infernal in. It came down to Mega versus Judo Suwa, and Suwa ended up being shaved. All Japan. Major lineups for the January tour. January 2nd at Korakuen Hall has the Heavyweight Battle Royal, Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Jinsei Shinzaki versus Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama and Kentaro Shiga, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao and Hiroshi Hazi versus Vader and Manukia Mossman and Johnny Smith. January 3rd at Korakuen Hall has Misawa and Hazi versus Vader and Mossman, Tawada and Tao and Jun Izumida versus Kobashi and Akiyama and Shinzaki, Bart Gunn and Johnny Ace versus Wolf Hockfield and Johnny Smith and the Junior Heavyweight Battle Royal. January 7th in Kochi has the Kawada and Tao defense against Kobashi and Akiyama, Misawa and Ogawa and Hazi versus Vader and Mossman and Smith, Ace and Gunn versus Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama. January 15th at Yokohama Bunka Gym has Kobashi versus Vader, Misawa and Shinzaki versus Kawada and Tao Ogawa versus Masahito Kakihara for the PWF Junior title, which officially puts Kakihara in junior heavyweight competition, which by weight, he should be in but it kills him for a push, Akiyama and Hazi versus Albright and Hockfield. Tour ends January 22nd in Osaka with Misawa defending the Triple Crown against Kawada, Kobashi and Akiyama and Shinzaki versus Vader and Takayama and Kakihara Ogawa versus Smith. On the following tour the major shows will be February 21st in Kobe and 3/6 at Budokan Hall. December 6th TV show with the Tag Team Tournament Final did a 5.2 rating.
New Japan. Masahiro Chono was announced as returning to the ring on February 5 in Sapporo. He was announced in what sounds really strange in 1-against-2 handicap matches on February 5 in Sapporo against Keiji Muto and Hiro Saito, and on February 6 against Muto and Satoshi Kojima, which is totally unlike normal New Japan booking philosophy on many levels. To make things even more strange, after New Japan announced this on December 22, the next day Chono said his neck injury is still really bad and can't move his neck. He said that he wouldn't be able to start even light training until January 10 and said that he didn't know for sure if he would be able to return to the ring and said he didn't think he'd be ready by early February. Tokyo Dome ticket sales are reported as being well behind usual. Of course, usual has often meant selling out weeks in advance. The general feeling is New Japan totally overestimated how much from a ticket selling standpoint Atsushi Onita means today, even though his being on the show has garnered a ton of pub. Hiroyoshi Tenzan went to Germany this past week to work for Otto Wanz on his big show in Bremen. All we know is that he went under the name Big Tenzan, and went to a 6-round draw against Ice Train. It was billed as a grudge match as the two feuded in Germany in 1993-94 when Tenzan was known as Hiro Yamamoto. After the match Tenzan gave Ice Train an Aristocrat pendant, so he may be coming into New Japan next year. After the Dome, the following tour will feature a tournament to determine the number 1 contender for the IWGP Heavyweight title. The 4 first-round matches take place on January 27 at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym with Kazuo Yamazaki vs. Kojima, Shinya Hashimoto vs. Manabu Nakanishi, Tenzan vs. Shiro Koshinaka and Kensuke Sasaki vs. Yuji Nagata, bracketed in that order. The semifinals are on February 11 in Osaka and the finals on February 12 in Gifu. The tournament winner faces the IWGP Heavyweight title winner of the January 4 Tokyo Dome match with Scott Norton vs. Keiji Muto in the main event on February 14 at Budokan Hall. Also at Budokan Hall will be the Masa Saito retirement match, and a 2 out of 3 fall 10-man with Masaaki Mochizuki, WAR, and Masao Orihara, Balorts, and Great Sasuke Michinoku, and Jushin Liger and El Samurai vs. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Kendo Kashin and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani and Koji Kanemoto. February 5 in Sapporo has Liger and Sasuke vs. Wagner and Kashin, Junji Hirata and Sasaki vs. Tenzan and Kojima, Brian Johnston and Hashimoto vs. Don Frye and Dave Beneteau, Osamu Kido vs. Kengo Kimura, a celebration of Kido's 30-year pro career which actually began February 21, 1969. The Chono handicap match and Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka defend the IWGP tag titles against Nagata and Nakanishi. February 6 in Sapporo has Michael Wallstreet and NWO Sting and Norton vs. Tadao Yasuda and Hashimoto and Fujinami, Tenryu and Koshinaka and Michiyoshi Ohara vs. Nagata and Nakanishi and Sasaki, Takaiwa and Otani vs. Kashin and Sasuke, Tenzan vs. Yamazaki, Liger vs. Wagner for the IWGP Junior title, and the other title match on the tour will be February 11 in Osaka with an IWGP Junior Tag title match. December 5 TV did a 2.2 rating. Other Japan notes. Luthez also appeared at the December 16 Battle Arts show in Moto Kawagoe. After Alexander Otsuka knocked out Katsuji Takamura, Thez came into the ring from the dressing room and raised Otsuka's hand, basically congratulating him for representing pro wrestling with his win over Marco Ruiz at the Tokyo Dome. Upcoming PANCRASE dates are January 19 at Korakuen Hall and February 11 in Osaka. Masayoshi Motegi has been appearing with Michinoku Pro this past week as a heel tag team with Great Sasuke. Version ran its biggest show to date on December 18 at Yokohama Bunka Gym before a small crowd of a little more than 1,000. Mariko Yoshida beat Kandi Akutsu in the main event to become the first Queen of Version, instead of heavyweight champion. The name is meant to be similar to King of Pancrase to give the idea that the matches are shoots, which they aren't. They did have 4 shoot matches on the undercard, with the big result being Russian judo champ Rosina Alina, who in 1996 won a UFC-style women's tournament, beating Reggie Bennett, who had lost an ungodly amount of weight to get in shape for the match. LLPW announced its company awards naming Shinobu Kondori as Wrestler of the Year and Kondori vs. Svetlana Gundarenko as Match of the Year. Abdullah the Butcher returns to Japan on January 2 for Big Japan. The main event for War on January 15 at Korakuen Hall will be Genichiro Tenryu and Shoji Nakamaki vs. Shigeo Okamura and Nobutaka Araya. Nakamaki will also return to IWA Japan. Here and there. The Jesse Ventura mania continues. Lerner Publishing is coming out with a Ventura bio aimed at kids, which will be written by Keith Elliott Greenberg, whose many hats include writing for WWF magazines and producing segments for hard copy.
Yet a third movie is now in production, which makes 3 books and 3 movies by the latest count.
NBC's Dateline did a segment on him on December 22 where he was interviewed by Maria Shriver. He said that because of the dignity of the office of governor he won't react the way the old Jesse would be ribbing and criticism. Overall I'd say he came off well, as a good person, but also someone who gave the impression he very well may be in over his head. Time will tell.
The A&E biography on him is scheduled for December 30th.
In Minnesota, Ventura has been under some media criticism for agreeing to a quick turnaround in writing his autobiography at the same time he's going to be setting up his administration. Ventura also talked about not ruling out taking endorsement deals until he collects his first check, and even went so far as to say even after taking office, he feels he could take endorsement deals as long as he doesn't use the words governor in the ad.
Local radio stations, including FAN, which employed him, at talk show hosts question whether the citizens elected Ventura to be a governor or a pop star.
He also claimed that Gary Trudeau is wrongfully making money off his trademarked persona.
Trudeau writes the politically satirical Doonesbury comic strip, which Ventura was the subject of about 2 weeks ago.
Technically, Jesse the Body Ventura is not a person, but the name of a role played by actor Jim Janos first within the world of pro wrestling. He owns the rights to his name since he came up with the name and used it on a professional basis before the WWF, which then began trademarking everyone's names. The WWF was, for example, able to stop Ray Traylor from now only being Big Boss Man, but even the Boss were doing a prison warden gimmick since they came up with the character for him. But they can't stop Randy Savage, Roddy Piper or Jesse Ventura from using their names and gimmicks after leaving WWF because they used them prominently before ever coming to WWF, or in the case of Bret Hitman Hart, Hart trademarked the Hitman name himself.
There was a big argument years ago because they tried to stop Bruno Sammartino from marketing himself as the living legend, claiming they came up with that nickname for him.
Another controversial one was Honky Tonk Man, who continued to use the name after leaving WWF, because he did the same gimmick under the name Honky Tonk Wayne before going to WWF. He didn't run for office as Jim Janos, but as Jesse Ventura, so at that point he's using his trademarked character name as a real-world celebrity name and not an actor playing the role of Jesse Ventura, and at that point, he has no more control over his name being used in cartoons,
movies or books than John Wayne, which wasn't his real name either, or any other celebrity would.
The December 19th Memphis show had a Christmas theme to it. They brought the cameras to Jerry Lawler's house and did live cutaways. Angle alert. Brian Christopher vs. Aaron O'Grady ended when Tony Falk, dressed like Santa Claus, threw a Christmas cane at O'Grady, who threw it back but Christopher then pulled out a chain for the win. Sean Stasiak now uses a mirror as a prop. Christopher came out for an interview and said that every year, he always exchanges Christmas presents with Lawler. He also then pulled 2 cookies out of his trunks and said they were Christmas presents for announcers Dave Brown and Corey Macklin. He said he had to rush to the mall to get Lawler and Stacy their presents, and then go over to Lawler's house. Lawler from his house said he really didn't think Christopher would come, but since he was bringing a gift, he'd let him in. I hope Brian wasn't going to shock his folks by bringing home his new boyfriend.
Randy Hales said that Mick Tierney was on probation for going nuts last week.
Tierney came out, didn't apologize, and offered $5,000 to anyone in the audience who could beat him.
A Planet fan, an independent worker from East Tennessee who goes by the ring name Mark Gordy, tried to accept but everyone tried to talk him out of it. Angle alert.
The fan claimed he'd been in tough man contests all over the place and could take Tierney.
He said that he's fought for real and wrestling is phony. I've been waiting for the day they use this in an angle.
Brown tried to talk him out of it and Hales called the fan a big fat idiot, then had him sign a release. Brown was mad at Hales for how he was handling things. Anyway, they had the match and of course, Tierney destroyed him and mad him tapped to a choke. Tierney kept beating on the guy after the match until Baldo and Vic Grimes pulled him off. Hales afterwards said he knew it wasn't a good idea but he was tired of people all his life saying wrestling was fake. Anyway, the show ended back at Lawler's house with Christopher with a giant box saying it was a gift for Stacy. She opened it and it was Stasiak, who started breaking ornaments on the tree and causing a mess at the Lawler household. Sean opened up a gift that was a CD for Stacy and threw it across the ring and started trying to kiss Stacy under the mistletoe. She ran away and locked herself in a room. Christopher joked that she probably had bad breath and was brushing her teeth. Lawler threw fire at Stasiak and Christopher grabbed him and they ran out to the car and drove off. At this point back in the studio, all the faces with Tom Nunnery, a local singer who has been friends with Lawler for decades, started singing Santa Claus is Coming to Town and the heels ran out and jumped the faces while Nunnery ignored all the brawling and kept singing, which was said to have been hilarious.
Referee Lolly Dude legitimately needed staples put in the back of his head after a hard chair shot by Rocco Rock in a December 10th match in Bound Brook, New Jersey. He was removed by paramedics and rushed to the hospital. Colorado Kid will be going to other NWA offices with his North American title from Music City, which is recognized nationally by the NWA. On January 1st, he'll face Kit Carson in North Richland Hills, Texas for NWA Southwest, and on January 24th, he'll face Greg Valentine in Winter Haven, Florida for NWA Florida. TNN's documentary to hype the debut of its Roller Jam, called Roller Jam, Roller Derby Reborn, will air on December 26th at 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. Rest of the times listed are for both Eastern and Pacific, December 27th at 1:30 p.m., January 2nd at 5 p.m., January 3rd at 3 p.m. and January 10th at 3 p.m. In regard to the USA Today article talking about other leagues, books and movies, there is only one other active derby-type league going, a Northern California-based league which runs occasional games featuring the stars from the 60s and 70s and some of their sons and daughters. The older skaters are mostly in their 50s and pushing 60, actually the oldest, Ann Calvello, who came back from a brain tumor last year and still skates the entire game at the age of 69. There is one book we know of in the works. There are two movie-type works, both documentaries, one of which is the TNN documentary that airs this week, the other is one on Calvello. There are rumors of other cable networks being interested in starting their own deal, but nothing is definite, although there are others looking at the idea of doing a wrestling/roller derby prime time package. A correction on results from a November 29th Muse show. Ramblin' Rich and Jimmy Janetti beat Chain Gang, not the other way around, and it was James Proper and not James Rocker who beat Major Mayhem. MMA. There is talk of another KRS show in Japan in April, but only the very beginning of negotiations going on for it. UFC lightweight champ Pat Miletic is going to try his hand at pro boxing on a show in his home city of Davenport, Iowa on January 20th. It's a show billed as mixed boxing, where it'll have 5 MMA matches and 5 pro boxing matches. Promoter Monty Cox, who has done extreme challenge shows for years, is trying to do combination shows as a monthly deal to try and cross-promote MMA to boxing fans. There are rumors that Jorge Patino, who is Miletic's scheduled opponent on the January 8th pay-per-view show, may not be able to get out of Brazil. If that's the case, Miletic would likely face Frank Trigg, which in reality on paper is a more competitive fight anyway. The TV commercial for the next pay-per-view builds everything around the debut of Boss Rutan, who they are pushing as the best fighter in the world. Haven't had a chance to watch the complete tape, but based on what I've seen, the K1 show looked to be a tremendous event. Sion Latu, who claimed to be the younger brother of WCW wrestler The Barbarian, is in an alternate slot for the next UFC. Latu a few months back fought and lost via submission in about 90 seconds to Tsuyoshi Kosaka in a shoot match on a Rings show. ECW. There were several new faces brought in and tried out at the December 19th ECW Arena show, including Steve Corino, Yoshihiro Tajiri, Antifaz del Norte, Robert Gibson, Rex King and Wolfie D, along with a new valet character who is an unknown trained by Rod Price, who tried out a few months back and wowed everyone with her bump-taking ability. Tajiri got over the best of the group in a match with Antifaz, which was said to have been the best match on the card, but went a few minutes long. Current plans for the January 10th pay-per-view show are the ECW title match with Shane Douglas defending. It'll be either a three-way with Taz and Sabu or a singles match with Taz in which Sabu will figure into the outcome. The decision will be made this week as the final angles will be shot at the December 26th TV tapings in Queens, which is the final TV before the show. Tommy Dreamer vs. Justin Credible in a ladder match with a cane on the ladder is confirmed. The three-way match planned with Jerry Lynn, Lance Storm and Mikey Whipwreck may be changed. Whipwreck has agreed to work the show, but it's in nobody's best interest to send him out there for the crowd to do its ignorant chant of "You sold out," which will take the focus of the match away from Lynn, who needs to get over strong since he's being considered for the main event spot. He will wrestle Rob Van Dam either as the main or semifinal on the 321 pay-per-view show, and Storm, who they are grooming for a higher position. Spike Dudley and Reckless Youth are being considered for the third spot, and they could do worse than put those two in a singles match considering the great match, at least in edited form, they had on TV a few weeks ago. The only other matches confirmed are Van Dam vs. Masato Tanaka for the TV title and Super Crazy vs. Tajiri, both of which should be great but entirely different matches. There are several different ideas being batted around for the Dudleys, although Paul Heyman seems to be shying away from his original idea of putting them against Axl Rotten and Balls Mahoney in sort of a barbed wire bat gimmick match.
Heyman had spoken with Public Enemy about coming back, but they asked for a $1,500 per week guarantee apiece for 1 year, and he's only interested in using them for a few months.
There are negotiations going on for ECW to get Takamichi Inoku and Dick Togo for 6 months, as Vince McMahon has no plans to do anything with them and would allow ECW to use them, similar to the deal with Al Snow and some others. At this point, Chris Condito and Tammy Sytch aren't scheduled to appear on December 26th, but are figured into potential plans for the pay-per-view show.
It is not a definite, but a possibility that Reckless Youth will debut in Queens, but the plan is for Super Crazy to debut at that show.
A trial date has been set for New Jack in April, stemming from the Eric Kulas incident where Jack bladed him wrong, and he bled a revolting amount in an incident that made it very difficult after seeing it to enjoy wrestling for a long time.
The business dealings with FMW may have fallen through. ECW claims they were screwed on their promised money from the last tour by FMW, although Heyman said he was expecting it to happen.
The money in question in what we brought up a few weeks back about FMW wanting to be reimbursed for what they claimed were unused non-refundable plane tickets from no-shows by Bam Bam Bigelow, Condito, and Sytch, and an upgrade from coach to business class on a previous appearance by Bigelow.
The TV show this past weekend, built around edited clips of Shane Douglas' title match with Gedo and Sabu and Van Dam winning the tag titles from Dudley's, both from Caraco and Hall, was one of the worst ECW TV shows of the year. Both bouts were heavily edited, and the Douglas match didn't look bad, but wasn't much either. The tag title match had a lot of hot moves, including an incredible dive by Van Dam that popped the crowd, but overall had no heat, and a 14 minutes match edited down to 5 minutes on a show featuring mainly repeated material probably tells you all you need to know about what the match was like in unedited form. At the December 19th ECW Arena show, ring announcer Bob Ortiz, in a total spoof not meant to be taken seriously, faked like he had a heart attack, then jumped up and said it was a rib. Just incredible. Jason, who said he was given an offer by Kevin Nash to join WCW but turned it down because he was scared of the 90-day contract cycles, feeling if he was let go, ECW wouldn't take him back, and Chastity came out.
They turned on Chastity, so this was her storyline farewell, and she was beaten up by the new, as of yet unnamed African-American woman who was a great bump taker.
Tommy Dreamer ended up coming out but was attacked by Terry Funk. Nova beat Corino in a match where they did a lot of moves, but it was total indie-level work. Tajiri beat Antifas in a match where Tajiri looked good and Antifas appeared to be getting carried. After an angle where Danny During claimed to be the illegitimate son of Robert Gibson and during an Amish roadkill lost to the FBI in a match that wasn't good and went too long. Storm won a three-way over Rex King and Wolfie D to get a title shot later in the show. Spike Dudley beat Skull Von Crush. Van Dam beat Mahoney in what was said to have been a real good match, but the finishing Van Daminator looked bad. Bubba Ray Dudley and Rod Price threw New Jack off a stage through 2 tables. Dudley's then beat Mike Lazansky and One Man Gang and Rod Price. Sabu was scheduled to wrestle Taz for the FTW title. Funk came out and said he wanted a 3-way, and when they agreed, Funk chickened out and sent Credible in his place. It wound up with Credible pinned, and then Taz destroyed Sabu by suplexing him on his head, knocking him out. Taz then put Sabu on top of him as the ref counted 3 and Taz laid down to Sabu won the title, but Sabu was carried out on a stretcher. Douglas beat Storm in the final match. December 17th in Allentown, Pennsylvania drew 1,500 for a show headlined by Dreamer winning a 3-way over Storm and Credible. Douglas and Van Dam both didn't appear due to being involved in separate lawsuits from previous appearances. Big Dick Dudley did work the shows over the weekend and will be working December 26th, and possibly sporadic dates after that point. WCW. Referee Brady Boone, who wrestled in the 80s as Brady Boone, Firecat and Battlecat for WWF, WCW, All Japan and numerous indies in the 80s, was killed in a car accident late on December 15th. Boone had refereed a TV taping earlier that night in Palmetto, Florida, and had driven home to Tampa. He went back driving to pick up a pizza he'd ordered and apparently fell asleep at the wheel and his car went over an embankment. Boone was 40. Boone was a very quiet private person who was survived by a wife and 2 kids. In his prime as a wrestler, he was considered a good worker, but that was in the era where size was king and he was very short. So worked mainly as a jobber in the WWF during its heyday. The irony is that Boone got the position with WCW taking the spot of Brian Hildebrand. A snowstorm and a temperature of 4 degrees basically killed all the walk-up for the record-setting Nitro at the TWA Dome.
The show did break the all-time U.S. record for a non-WWF arena event by doing $914,389, ahead of the July 6 Georgia Dome, which did $906,330. In better weather, the $1 million mark would have been threatened. The paid attendance was approximately 29,000, so it actually trailed the December 7 Astrodome show despite being announced on TV as having beaten it, although that fact was entirely due to weather. It destroyed all records for St. Louis. It was probably a rare Nitro of late where the crowd probably left for the most part as if they'd seen something, although it was totally carried by Flair. David Finlay beat Scott Putski in 13:23 with a tombstone. There was nothing wrong with the work in this match, but who were the chimpanzees who booked these two for so long in the unopposed segment? Ernest Miller then came out to challenge anyone in the crowd. Santa Claus came out and suplexed Miller twice, and unmasked, revealing Perry Saturn. There was no pop at all for this. Chavo Guerrero Jr. beat Kaz Hayashi in 2:56 with a swinging DDT. Kevin Nash did an interview. He got a mixed reaction and a lot of chants of Goldberg. He turned the crowd toward him when he brought up that he was World WWF champ for a year. I don't know why everyone in WCW is so oblivious to this concept, but crowds today want to hear things they think they aren't supposed to, and at that point they once again pretend it's real. Nash got over because everyone knows you don't refer to your previous lifetimes in the WWF. Nash then repeated a Flair cliché of to be the man, you have to beat the man. I have no clue what that has to do with Nash. Anyway, it was better than his interviews have been lately. Gene Okerlund interviewed Raven. He got a mixed reaction. He actually said something funny about his mom. No, it isn't his real mom. It was an actress who apparently went to the same acting school as that lady years ago who played Cactus Jack's wife when he was suffering from amnesia in one of those classically bad WCW angles, just wanting to get attention for herself and be on TV, figuring if Judy Bagwell could hold half the tag title in WCW, then she figured she could go on TV and spear Goldberg. He wound up jumping canyon until Mom showed up, and in the amateur hour segment of the show, she said something or other to lead to the next part of this angle. Hey, at least it's an angle. Eric Bischoff did an interview. They spent almost the whole show at this trying to get Bischoff over. They showed the Horseman Steve McMichael is still gone, apparently in massive depression after seeing how good his ex-wife looked almost naked after only $10 gazillion worth of plastic surgery arriving. Bischoff continued to talk oblivious to the fact everyone in the building on the big screen knew the Horsemen were around. All four went into the NWO dressing room and did a 4-on-1 on Scott Norton. By the way, Keiji Muto was not there, so his angle with Norton obviously didn't take place, although he is in Minnesota getting treatment for his knees. With four guys, one of whom was Flair, who may be old, but this segment was specifically designed for Norton to play stooge and get Flair over, and another was Arn Anderson with a lead pipe. Norton didn't want to sell it all. Norton was basically holding his own with all four. Save that crap for Japan where you're a star. He should have been fired for screwing the angle that bad, and by the way, they should dump Bryan Adams in a river, or better yet, send them both one-way tickets out of town for all the good they do WCW. It took Flair forever to make it to the ring, but the place went nuts when he did. He was running around chasing Bischoff. Tony Schiavone said that he must not have really had a heart attack. Originally they were going to say it wasn't a heart attack but that Bischoff poisoned him backstage, but luckily they heard just how retarded that sounds, so they just dropped the heart attack angle almost cold. Not quite as cold as those broken ribs The Rock was suffering from last week. Flair swore on the graves of Dick the Bruiser and Bruiser Brody. The local fans got a kick out of Flair remembering the local legends, that he'd kill Bischoff and Barry Windham if he touched them on this night. Wrath beat Lizmark Jr. with a meltdown in 3:52. Eddie Guerrero beat Rey Mysterio Jr. in 16:11 when Billy Kidman's attempt to help Rey backfired. Kidman hasn't wrestled in the past week due to both a torn rotator cuff and pulled groin muscle. He's supposed to take time off, but at press time was planning to at least do the triangle match at Starrcade before taking time off. This was an awesome match, but you know what the ratings said. Scott Steiner and Marcus Bagwell came out. Bagwell was dressed as Mark McGuire in a Cardinals jersey and a bottle of Androsteindione came out. Scott asked McGuire Bagwell how many homers he'd have hit without it, and he said 5. Being that McGuire was nice enough to give Goldberg all that pub over the summer, doing that angle on him was pretty low class for WCW. Scott was supposed to burn the McGuire Cardinals jersey, but it wouldn't light. He wound up burning a Cardinals cap instead. Norman Smiley beat Prince Iaukea with a chicken wing in 1:44.
Van Hammer vs. Wyndham went 1 minute before Flair showed up and danced all night on a blown-up Wyndham's belly button. He gave Wyndham like 40 low blows, fingers to the eyes, fish hooked his mouth. Basically did every single maneuver illegal in UFC on the guy. Vincent, Horace Hogan and Bryan Adams ran down, but Benoit, Malenko and Arn Anderson took care of them. This went on for 5:30 with Benoit and Malenko brawling with Adams and Hogan by the production trucks before the police came out and maced Benoit and Malenko and handcuffed them. Adams did a terrible job selling for Benoit in a segment where his role was specifically to sell big. Finally Flair grabbed the mic and literally started crying, and he's the only wrestler in the business who in 1999 can get away with this. It was one of the great interviews of his life, talking about all these real things and weaving it into his storyline, which made people actually believe that a great deal, most, or even all of what he was saying was real. Bischoff came out, because the fans appeared to be having too much fun. Flair went after him and the police arrested Flair on charges of doing an interview that made everyone else in the business look like a rank amateur. Either that or for using obscene language in public in a pattern that tricked the censors. The announcers explained that the NWO has been doing this stuff for years and getting away with it, but when the horsemen do it they get arrested, and the explanation was that Bischoff controls the police force. Nothing makes local police departments look more corrupt or inept than a Monday night TV taping. Since Flair got arrested and we were assured not to be seeing him for the rest of the show, all the swing votes switched back to Raw. Booker T pinned Jerry Flynn with a missile dropkick in 2:25. Lex Luger beat Kenny Chaos with a torture rack in 3:39. Robbie Rage came out. Chaos has half of the tag team title with Rick Steiner, which makes no sense since Rick Steiner is out for months, and Chaos had already vacated the belts to form the infamous Steiner and Judy Bagwell championship team. Rage started yelling at Chaos about having the belts. He told him he'd have to make a choice, the belts or him, and since this issue was so important, WCW went to a commercial right in the middle of the angle, and when they came back, the announcers never acknowledged anything. Of all the inept booking decision of 1998 in WCW, the second stupidest, the booking of Warrior has to top the list, is the handling of the tag team straps. Especially since they have a tailor-made tag team of the year in Guerrero and Jericho, who they broke up after 3 weeks earlier this year, and had the coolest face team to oppose them in Ray and Juvie, who they never tagged again the minute they started getting over as a unit. Conan beat Alex Wright in 9:04 with the Tequila Sunrise. Conan and Disco Inferno were talking with Disco claiming to be part of the Wolfpack. Conan got in that toss the salad line again. Someone is going to figure out exactly what he's saying. Match sucked. Wright went on a roid rage after losing. Jericho jumped Conan and was whipping him with the belt and did a quebrada on his face, which sounds like a dance, but it's really more like a moonsault. Giant beat Disco in 2:57 with a choke slam. Giant then had a debate with Page in the crowd. I think Page called him Giant Scum or something. Finally Goldberg beat Hall via DQ in 2:56 when Nash pulled Hall out of the ring and Bigelow hit the ring. There was absolutely no reason for Goldberg to not jackhammer and pin Hall. Although it has still never been announced, it does look like Bigelow vs. Hall will take place at Starrcade. Officials from Paramount were at Nitro on December 14 getting wrestlers and announcers to sign intent to negotiate deals about a potential movie that would be based in the future and include sports dream matchups, including WWF vs. WCW wrestlers in the same movie. The Miami Herald did a story on Elizabeth. Mark Madden reported on the WCW hotline that she's gone to get surgical enhancements. It was proposed to do an angle where she would be linked with Billy Kidman, but she turned it down. It was described as being a Mrs. Robinson angle. Luckily I'm just young enough not to know what that means, but I think it was in a movie called The Graduate in the 60s where Dustin Hoffman played a college student and the mother of one of his classmates came on to him. Either she didn't want to be the mother of one of his classmates or didn't want to be linked to a cruiserweight in an angle doomed to mid-card oblivion. There were a lot of ill feelings during the middle of the week regarding the Flair angle. Some thought it was in incredibly bad taste to begin with. Others felt the company really insulted their intelligence as Bischoff and Arn Anderson tried to pretend it wasn't an angle. Only a very small percentage of the fans in Tampa believed it and very few of the wrestlers believed it, but the company still tried to play it up like Flair had a heart attack. There were people taken in, as apparently Dave Penzer and Charles Robinson were crying, and Doug Dillinger, who has probably known Flair for 20 years, was really upset. But apparently Dillinger ended up being really hot the way the company screwed with his emotions. The Thunder angle with Bischoff kissing Beth and punching David was edited off UK television. At this point it seems like a 98% lock. Giant will be done when his contract expires on February 9th. He may get liposuction done so he can start in Titan without the big gut. I guess it must be totally old-fashioned and out of date to suggest things like diet and exercise. Hart will appear on the January 16th episode of Mad TV.
In last week's story about his deal with WWF versus WCW, his WWF deal called for a maximum 200 dates, not 180 as listed, although he had already passed his 200 maximum before November and was still working. December 17th, Thunder in Charlotte drew a sellout 8,467,340, paying $126,985. It also drew a 3.91 rating and 6.3 share. Only one show was taped because Thunder will be preempted on both Christmas and New Year's Eve. Of course, WCW never mentioned it at any time on its broadcasts. Conan beat Chaos in 2:53. Steiner and Bagwell came out during the match. Rage showed up with his arm immobilized to heal his torn bicep to start arguing with Rage.
Fans were chanting, "We want Flair." Finlay beat Mike Enos in 3:52 with an inside cradle. Solid match. Enos jumped him afterwards. Mysterio Jr. was to wrestle Prince Iaukea. The LWO bullied Iaukea into not wrestling, which is the first guy they've successfully bullied to date. Juventud Guerrera took his place and it wound up with Eddie Frog splashing Mysterio Jr. and Juventud pinning him in 8:40 of a good but not great match. Prince came back out and told the ref, who reversed the decision. Iaukea then cleaned house on the LWO.
Disco beat Shima Nobunaga in 4:22 with a stunner.
Smiley beat Flynn in 3:45 with a chicken wing.
Jericho beat Saturn in 5:03 with a lion tamer after Miller knocked Saturn out with a kick that missed by a mile. Somewhere in the match, Jericho got his eye busted open.
Hall beat Luger via DQ when Steiner and Bagwell attacked Hall.
Luger got mad at them for costing him the match and the NWO did a run-in, but Hall, Luger and Conan cleaned house.
Show ended with Bischoff doing the angle where he attacked David Fleer. Wyndham gave him a few back suplexes. Fleer, Rick's oldest son, had been training of late with Bobby Eaton on how to take the bumps, while Adam stopped 10-year-old Reed from making the save. Beth hopped the rail and it wound up with Bischoff kissing her on the lips. Aside from the fact this was in Charlotte and there was no heat at all for any of this, it was a great angle. The day before in the Charlotte Observer, Tom Sorensen wrote a story that Flair really didn't have a heart attack. Flair mentioned in the story that some of his friends in wrestling were upset at what he did, a heart attack angle. But then the story tried to say it wasn't an angle, but that Flair had suffered numbness in his shoulder. Whatever. But basically in Charlotte, everyone knew Flair didn't have a heart attack and they all paid to see him above all. Then he wasn't there and they had to sit through a terrible show and be told Flair had a heart attack and they weren't buying it, and when they did the angle lots of people had already left and those that stayed weren't buying it. Because they won't be taping an edition of WCW Saturday Night for January 2nd, they are instead going to have a 2-hour Bill Goldberg special showing all of his major matches.
Boy, will that expose the problem.
Nash will start working full-time in the office in January. The Court of Appeals refused to hear WCW's appeal in the WWF lawsuit on the judge's ruling that Mark Madden isn't a journalist and therefore doesn't have the right to protect his sources.
So Madden will be depositioned again by Jerry McDevitt and have to reveal his sources of information. Lee Marshall will be done on January 4th. He went on Bob Ryder's website with an interview claiming he was quitting because WCW wanted him to move to Atlanta, and because he had a production company in Los Angeles, he didn't want to make the move. Actually, Marshall attempted a power play to get more airtime, largely trying to either cut into or get Mike Tenay's spot. When Tenay lost his voice before the November 30th Nitro and Marshall wasn't even used to take his place, he realized his die was cast. His contract was expiring and he opened negotiations with WWF, which basically guaranteed his exit. Tony Schiavone seemed so thrilled with Marshall that on the December 21st show when he led into the Road Report with Marshall's voice, Schiavone wouldn't even say his name. Telemundo has only agreed up to this point to carry a 1-hour pilot of the proposed Spanish-language show, and not to a 13-week deal. The first taping will be January 26th in Waco, Texas. The Thunder show scheduled for February 18th in Las Vegas will be moved to Salt Lake City. Bobby Walker wound up dropping his discrimination lawsuit against WCW. Apparently his lawyer refused to take the case on contingency, which means the lawyer is doing the case with no fee but gets a sizable percentage of the reward at the Ned, and Walker wouldn't pay the fee. Teddy Long was helping Walker in his case, and when it fell apart, it meant Long's days in WCW were numbered. He has since joined WWF as a ref, and started appearing at the last taping, although to this point they haven't acknowledged his name. WWF is considering breaking him off starting as a referee into being a character at some point.
Wahoo McDaniel was backstage at the show in Charlotte. Starter has signed to be a WCW licensee starting with the house show in Philadelphia on December 30th. You'll start seeing WCW performers wearing Starter gear on television. USA Today on December 18th ran a short piece on Dana Hall. Hall was quoted as saying about wrestling, "This is a form of entertainment that reaches millions of people, much of them children.
The abuse of status and bad role modeling and drug abuse among the wrestlers is out of control." Alan Sharp of WCW responded saying that Scott Hall was in rehab earlier this year, and since Scott has returned, he's been professional and performed his job for WCW like he should. The man has a right to make a living. He's conducted himself well with us. We can't just ask him to leave. Believe me, he came to one of our tapings and we felt like he was under the influence, yeah, we would have a problem. Ha 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 ha. Sorry, my computer went berserk having to type that quote. Like 2 car wrecks and 2 or 3 arrests. Some if not most having some relation to alcohol abuse directly after coming out of rehab in WCW's eyes constitutes not having a problem. I shouldn't even joke about this situation because what is so sad about this situation is that this profession learned absolutely nothing from the legacy of Brian Pillman and Louis Spicolli and everyone else, and just ignores problems, and 5 car wrecks over the last several months and incidents every other week indicate a problem. But to WCW, the only problem isn't that one of its wrestlers was damn lucky he wasn't killed on Thanksgiving weekend when he destroyed his car in something that after all the arrests and car wrecks can't be considered a random occurrence, but that his ex-wife is giving them some bad publicity in the national media. Don't get me wrong. Dana Hall has no media savvy and has said things not having to do with Hall that she have been better off from a credibility standpoint not saying because they are some strong charges that she can't prove are true and may very well not be true. But it's hard to consider in the big picture her as a bigger problem to WCW than what her ex has turned into. Because this business has become so high profile in recent months, the wrong death or odd will be a bigger news story than ever before to the national media. The problem is the profession will be more concerned about the news story and the fallout from it than care enough to do even the measures taken by real sports in attempting to prevent the actual deaths. Dana Hall has stated that she was misquoted in the recent National Enquirer story, although most of what was in the story was true, and that Scott Hall presented her with a contempt of court summons. She said she has given up speaking out on the subject because her sole purpose was to wake Scott up to address his problems and he doesn't care. There were some media outlets, at least for a short time, that reported the Flair heart attack as being real, particularly in Chicago. QVC will be doing a special on December 30th from the club at the First Union Spectrum where WCW will be doing its house show. In a story talked about months ago, due to the city council ruling against them over a land ownership dispute, Stu Hart financially has been put in position where he is having to sell the famous Hart House in Calgary that he's owned for decades, with the wrestling ring in the backyard that so many wrestlers trained in and the famed dungeon. They'll be moving shortly and are starting to pack things up. Alex Wright will disappear and return with a new character. February 7th house show in Cleveland is scheduled as Goldberg vs. Nash, Page vs. Hart, Sting vs. Hall, Flair and Benoit and Malenko vs. Wyndham and Hennig and Adams, Conan vs. Horace, Saturn vs. Miller, Ray vs. Juventud vs. Kidman Triangle, Smiley and Supercolo vs. Silver King and La Parka. January 4th Georgia Dome at press time had sold 25,483 tickets for $793,325. Philadelphia for December 30th was almost sold out, 15,014 tickets, while Nassau Coliseum on December 29th had sold 10,945 tickets. House shows for the week saw Saturday night tapings on December 15th in Palmetto, Florida drew 1,028 paying $18,290. This was one of the few, if not the only WCW show of the year that was a money loser. December 16th in Columbia, South Carolina draw 1,825 paying $37,365. December 18th in Tulsa drew a sellout 6,149 paying $103,430. December 19th in Springfield, Missouri drew a sellout 2,985 paying $73,547. December 20th in Kansas City, Missouri at Kemper Arena drew 12,829 paying $285,709. The biggest house show news was Goldberg in Selling for Giant in Tulsa, Goldberg's debut in his hometown, crack his head on the turnbuckle and get knocked silly. He may have suffered a concussion and immediately hit the spear and pinned Giant, not even trying the jackhammer. He was taken to the hospital and needed 16 stitches, and on TV you could see the big gash on the top of his head. In Springfield, Missouri, Giant came out in street clothes carrying the title belt and talked about hurting Goldberg in Tulsa. Giant then set the ref up for a choke slam off the ropes and Goldberg ran in, also in street clothes, Fear Giant, gave him the jackhammer, and the ref counted the pin.
Fans weren't exactly thrilled about a main event that basically didn't happen. The next night in KC, Goldberg used the spear and jackhammer to pin Bigelow in 39 seconds.
Both matches were cut way down because Goldberg wasn't 100%.
Springfield was made worse because matches with Conan vs. Eddie Guerrero and Luger vs. Adams were combined into a tag match after run-ins in the former. Stevie Ray missed the weekend house shows in Nitro due to a strained back.
Fans in Colombia were mad because Flair, scheduled to be in the Horseman corner, and Hart weren't there.
Signs were posted and refunds were offered. To show how good Malenko and Benoit are as a team, they had a great main event against Wyndham and Adams, although it was much better when Wyndham was in.
When Mysterio Jr.'s mask comes off at the house shows, that is a planned high spot and not a mistake, as they've done it several times.
Merchandise for the week was $353,747 or $5.79 per head. WCW Saturday Night on December 19th did a 2.1 rating. WWF. Steve Austin's status at press time over his torn muscle in his side was questionable. Austin needs to be at as close to 100% as possible for the Royal Rumble, since the storyline has him starting at number 1 and being there up until the end. Most likely either Austin or McMahon will win at the end, which would be 30 to 45 minutes depending on how the time limits are booked. So they have to give him time to heal properly. A decision was to be made midweek on whether he'll work the house shows in Chicago and at Madison Square Garden for sold-out shows on December 26th and December 27th. If the card has to be changed, it'll probably be some sort of a Corporation vs. DX tag match on top.
He'll no doubt appear at the TVs on December 28th in Albany and December 29th in Worcester, Massachusetts, because even if he isn't ready to work, he can always do angles and/or interviews.
There is really nothing new to report on the status of Jim Ross. He's improving slowly, but it doesn't appear likely he'll be able to broadcast at the next taping, so that makes at least 2 more Raws with him out of the booth.
Shawn Michaels went to a back specialist in New York to get another prognosis of his future or lack thereof in the ring.
Although there is a lot of talk about plans for he to wrestle Triple H at WrestleMania, there are no plans of him wrestling until doctors rule that it's possible for him to come back and give a timetable, which at this point hasn't happened. If he could wrestle by that time, that would seem to be a natural matchup. Raw on December 21st was taped December 15th in Spokane, Washington before a sellout 9,487 fans paying $221,235. With only one show during the past week, merchandise was $55,777 or $5.88 per head. The action-adventure series WWF no longer wants to be referred to as a wrestling TV show, and its performers are no longer to be called wrestlers on TV but instead sports entertainers, which had moments where it was truly hilarious, opened with Vince saying he was leaving to work out and putting Shane in charge, and told Patterson and Briscoe to make sure Shane's temper and ego don't get out of control.
Shane was doing an interview.
DX came out with Mankind. It wound up with Shane and Michaels making DX versus Corporation matches and Shane versus Mankind matches, while Patterson and Briscoe looked at each other as if there was going to be hell to pay. Snow pinned Gangrel in 258 with the snow plow. Lights flickered then went out, and when they went on, Snow was covered in blood, so those vamps were sucking his blood. He freaked out. Billy Gunn beat Shamrock when he reversed a Rana in 8:22. He was announced as new IC champ, but Michaels came out and explained it was a non-title match and blamed the ring announcer for making a faulty announcement. Billy gave Michaels a BA after the match. Hawk came out, looking like he'd been punched in the eye. He said that Droz was his drug pusher. Droz jumped Hawk, but Animal pulled him off. Lawler responded to this by saying there are no drugs in the WWF. That's rock and roll. Sex, maybe, but not drugs. Blackman beat Blue Blazer via DQ in 2:20 when Owen Hart interfered. Hart was claiming they edited the tape last week when it was revealed he was the Blue Blazer until Michael Cole informed him Raw was live last week. Goldust made the save. Blazer was unmasked as Jarrett. In between matches they were doing the Mark Henry skit with Jacqueline and Terry Runnels. Road Dogg beat Bossman to win the Hardcore title in 6:53. It was actually a good brawl outside the ring, with Bossman throwing him around with a noose around his neck. Dogg came off the riser seats with a double sledge onto Bossman, who was wearing a garbage can. Mankind hit Bossman with a pile and Dogg pinned him on the floor.
Scorpio and Holly beat Acolytes via DQ in 321.
Acolytes were DQ'd for absolutely no reason other than WWF script writers, Vince Russo, doesn't believe in finishes. Which actually is okay on Raw when the rest of the show is entertaining, but makes the pay-per-view shows totally blow. Bradshaw gave one of them the powerbomb and the ref was dreaming he was in WCW 6 months ago and called for the bell. Farouk looks to have lost about 25 pounds. The two now have matching tattoos.
Man, I wouldn't scar up my body for life for a gimmick that is doomed to go nowhere.
Shane vs. Mankind saw Shane throw a few jabs, which looked fine. Took a bump or two and didn't look too bad, and Mankind handed Shane a chair. Shane hit him, but Mankind no-sold. Patterson and Briscoe ran in and Patterson took his great bumps. Geez, the man is 60 years old and he's still 20 times the worker of Norton and Adams combined. Mankind gave Patterson a claw to the groin. He put the Socko claw on Shane until Rock made the save. X-Pac gave Shane the Bronco Buster. Fred Blassie did a funny skit playing an old perverted Santa Claus, inviting women to sit on his lap and ending by saying Santa's gonna get some tonight. With Henry not involved, Bangers beat Brown in 254 on their own. Most of this match saw Lawler talk about vibrators, whips, chains, hot wax and gerbils. Vince came back. This segment was hilarious as Patterson and Briscoe realized they were up the creek. Briscoe was crying that McMahon won't give him a Christmas bonus. Patterson said they should share the blame and Briscoe agreed. Then as soon as McMahon got out of the door, Briscoe claimed none of it was his fault. Hilarious. Finally Triple H and X-Pac no contest Rock and Test in 10 minutes. WCW can have the best new talent in the world for a year and not make them a star. WWF can take one green guy and simply through positioning, put him in position of being a star in 2 weeks. They announced Triple H and X-Pac at a combined weight of 469 pounds, which is not a number pulled out of a hat. Gunn and China were playing grab ass, so something may come of that. Michaels told DX to leave ringside but Vince told them to stay. Test was pretty green when it came to selling, but he was in there with good people who were over so he was acceptable, but clearly being pushed way beyond his current capabilities. Match ended when the lights went out and Kane showed up, joining the corporation and choke-slamming Triple H, Gunn, Dog, X-Pac, and as the show went off the air, he had his hand around Chyna's throat. After that show ended live, they taped Super Astros with Negro Casas over Papi Chulo, Miguel Perez over Mike Hollow, Armando Fernandez over Apollo Dantes and did a DOA over Christopher and Kevin Quinn match for Probably Shotgun. They taped Heat for December 27th. Jarrett and Hart beat Godfather and Venus when Deborah flashed Venus and Jarrett pinned him. Golga, with George Steele in the corner, beat Mosh. Shamrock and Bossman beat Hardy Boys. Maine saw Kane over X-Pac via DQ as Kane destroyed him but DX made the save. After the match and probably after the show went off the air, DX got 5 women to flash and then Gunn mooned the crowd. Insane Clown Posse's take on their quitting WWF is that the company's portrayal of them was goofy and inaccurate with their musical character. Early estimates of the Rock Bottom pay-per-view are in 0.78 buy rate or a $3.48 million company gross. It's about the same level or slightly down for most of the B-level pay-per-view shows for WWF have been doing the past several months. Capital Carnage pay-per-view reportedly did 86,000 buys in the UK. Tentative plans are for another UK pay-per-view show in May. Sable did her Playboy shoot this past week in Santa Monica. They spent all day on December 18th shooting for a potential cover. From what we're told, it is not a guarantee she'll be on the cover, but it is close to it. The issue will come out the first week of March and be dated in April, and be used as a cross-promotion for WrestleMania. She will appear totally nude in some of the photos. The profile will feature her as Rena Mero, and not so much as Sable, and acknowledge her marriage to Mark Mero. Playboy does more fixing of photos than Disney did animation in A Bug's Life, so any little imperfections will vanish in the photos. Some notes from the Capital Carnage pay-per-view show. There was an edit in the open of the show package as the Fatal Four, Austin, Undertaker, Mankind and Kane, when first booked and announced was to be a title match. Jim Ross, in doing the broadcast while he was getting Bell's palsy, tried to insinuate that Terry Runnels was faking the pregnancy, I guess to explain one of those disappearing angles. On Raw December 21st, they acknowledged the pregnancy and gave the impression she wasn't showing yet. Jacqueline was wearing a ripped t-shirt with no bra, so when Sable removed the t-shirt on purpose while she was on the ref's shoulders, both her breasts were exposed, actually for only a few seconds, but it was played up big. Because WWF did that on December 6th made people think on December 13th they were going to get to see Deborah McMichael in the same state of undress. The show, at least in the first half, had great heat, and while it came off from an angle standpoint more like a house show than a pay-per-view, the wrestlers seemed to be working harder, but not necessarily better, than a regular house show. Ross and particularly Lawler tried to use a lot of British slang while calling the action. After the announcement on Raw, Mick Foley got something like a zillion votes for Time Magazine Man of the Year. At one point the poll shut down, and a rumor started that they were going to eliminate Foley from the list. Wrestling fans then upped their reputation greatly to folks online as they were leaving all kinds of homophobic gay-bashing messages in the folder devoted to the late Matthew Shepard, who was second behind Foley on the list. At one point Bret Hart's fans got him up to number 3. Somehow I don't think these magazines are going to be doing a lot of polls of this type in the future. The current issue of People magazine, the one with the 25 most intriguing people cover, featured Austin as a breakthrough star of 1998. WWF, in plugging the magazine on Raw, tried to insinuate the magazine named Austin as one of the 25 most intriguing people of the year, which wasn't the case. Mark McGuire was the only jock who made it. The story was only 2 graphs, with McMahon quoted as saying he's the biggest superstar in wrestling history, which is about 10 years premature. The story claims he sells 1 million t-shirts a month. If you think about that for even a second, you'll realize how preposterous that is. About 20,000 per month is closer to reality, unless Austin is getting $60 million royalty checks. Nobody knows about Hunter Hearst Helmsley, China, Mero and Sable all signed contract renewals, I believe for 3 years. Pablo Marquez Babu has been returned to the United States. Once he gets all his paperwork problems cleared up, there is a good chance he'll be rehired. From Phil Mushnick's December 18 New York Post column, we laughed out loud this week while reading that 4 WWF wrestlers recently visited a Connecticut high school to deliver an anti-drug message to students. Is there any athletic enterprise more synonymous with illegal drug use than pro wrestling? Actually there is. Pro bodybuilding. Heck, in last week's TV Guide, WWF boss Vince McMahon was quoted on the WWF's latest drug policy. If we found a syringe filled with steroids, we'd say, "What the hell are you doing?" But the audience doesn't give a damn. No one cares. No one cares. This formed the top dog in an industry that regularly sees its performers drop dead in their 30s. This from the same Vince McMahon who, after he and his WWF were found to be swimming in drugs a few years ago, openly bragged that the WWF's new drug testing policy would be so stringent that it would surpass anything in the legitimate sports world. A&E will be doing its biography special on Andre the Giant on January 13th. WWF ref Tim White, who was Andre's best friend at the time of his death, will apparently be a prominent part of the feature. Luna is going to turn on Sable at the next tapings to set up a title match at Royal Rumble. They're going to use Luna for a few months until they get Terry Pac ready for her angle, and after that runs its course, they'll probably get to Sable versus Deborah McMichael. The Detroit News ran a huge feature on wrestling in December 20th. The story focused on the raunchiness and recent angles on both shows, but mainly Raw, ending with a line that McMahon is laughing about it all the way to the bank. It said the recent TV Guide with Hogan, Austin, Undertaker and Goldberg on the cover had the highest newsstand sell-through percentage of any issue since Princess Diana's death. UK ratings for December 4th saw Raw beating Nitro 350,000 to 260,000, making 6 weeks in a row Raw has won and the margin of victory is growing. A correction from last week, we reported Raw with 250,000 viewers and it was 350,000. Thunder drew 90,000, its lowest ever. Superstars drew 70,000 and ECW reruns drew 60,000 on average for its weeknight run. According to Relevant Knowledge/Media Metrics, WWF.com is the #1 site on the web for males 12 to 17. Super Astros ratings for December 20th were an 11.3 in Chicago, down from usual but still very good. A 3.4 in Los Angeles, awful. A 4.6 in Miami, good. A 5.9 in New York, good. And a 4.4 in San Antonio. Decent weekend ratings saw Livewire at 1.9, Superstars at 1.5 and Heat at 3.46 with a 5.7 share. The readers' pages. NWA have been competing in the New Jersey-based NWA for 2 years now, and of late there are several issues that need to be addressed, including false advertising, mismanagement, and the blatant disrespect for the fans. On November 13th in Hazlet, New Jersey, the list of no-shows included Al Snow, Draws, Gangrel, Luna, Public Enemy, and 911. They were all advertised on the posters and flyers. There was no sign posted at the door nor an announcement made about them not being there. Surprisingly, Sid Vicious did show up. The substitute main event was Bob Backlund versus Lance Diamond. The charity paid $7,000 for this sold show and got that as a main event. In Dennis Corraluzzo's pre-show speech, he said to work hard to make up for the no-shows because he wasn't going to acknowledge them. During the so-called main event, there were 1,000 fans, who came only to see the WWF guys, booing and angrily chanting "We want head." They were close to rioting when they realized they were screwed.
I was in the hallway with Corraluzzo and 5 other wrestlers when he asked us what he should do.
We said to go out and tell the truth and apologize to the crowd. He thought about it for a second, then said, "The fans. I got my money. Let's get out of here. We're never coming back here again." Then he and his partner, Johnny Falco, divided up their money and went out the back door. The wrestlers had to wait 45 minutes before we could leave because the fans were angry.
And when we left, we had to answer questions about the no-shows from fans that remained.
On December 5th in Toms River, New Jersey, Sid was advertised in the main event and no-showed.
A lame announcement was made that his sister had just died in a car wreck.
On December 12th, Sid again no-showed in Baltimore. To top it all off, on every poster and flyer made for every show, it listed as WWF/NWA Wrestling, even when no WWF wrestlers are even listed.
I guess even Corraluzzo realizes the NWA name doesn't mean a thing.
With false advertising and a the fans attitude, and letting untrained ticket sellers come off the streets and go into the ring and play pro wrestler in semi-main events because they sold 20 tickets, the NWA is killing these towns and wrestling in general. Corraluzzo has even had his flunky Falco try to sabotage other local indies that acquire sold shows by lying to the charities involved, giving them misinformation about the quality of the product.
That is a fact, and he's been caught once.
We drew only 400 fans at the 50th anniversary show. Our house shows without WWF names: Yardville, Mount Holly, Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania, all bomb. The ECW Reject Invasion angle this summer stunk and drew no more than 200 fans for any show. It's time for new blood in the NWA.
I'd rather work on pure independent shows where the fans can truly appreciate wrestling and enjoy themselves instead of being involved in a con.
Name withheld by request. Wrestling with Shadows. I really didn't think this movie could live up to all the hype like most movies nowadays. Boy, was I wrong. It was so entertaining on so many levels, mainly because I think having somewhat inside knowledge about wrestling made the emotions all that more entertaining. Personally, I don't think watching it from an outsider's perspective, one would be able to fully get the emotions of what Bret was going through when he was screwed at the end. I know Vince McMahon is not an angel, but I also think he was kind of unfairly portrayed in the movie as being a whole lot worse than he really is. I'm sure he must have some good points too. Joe Wynn. Houston, Texas.
I don't understand your interpretation of Bret Hart's 30-day control clause.
You imply that it means he can control the bookings and finishes. Hart says he has reasonable creative control.
This seems to me to imply that he has input, but not complete control.
It seems this clause would allow him to veto a match with Michaels where he sells for 5 minutes and then does a clean job. Of course, what the term reasonable creative control means is up for debate, but it seems this interpretation is more in line with the phrase.
Otherwise he would be given complete creative control.
Then he would have the right to veto a finish. I think a good argument could be made that Bret's interpretation of this clause to mean he had full booking control of his finishes is what made Vince feel his hand was forced. When did the Boss Rutan vs. Masakatsu Funaki match that has been such a hot topic of debate take place? Dan Cirquitella. Seattle, Washington. Response from Dave Meltzer. Reasonable creative control as it was interpreted legally, and this did turn into a legal issue over the last week before the match, and was explained clearly in the movie, meant all booking decisions over the last 30 days had to be mutually agreed upon by both parties. Neither side had the power to dictate anything to the other side.
The fact that Titan lawyers didn't even debate this definition is shown by after Montreal, despite Hart having walked out on the company, Titan continued to pay him his $28,800 weekly salary for the remainder of his contract.
Full creative control in the contract would have meant that Hart would have had the right to dictate all his bookings, which meant matches, angles, opponents and finishes, with McMahon having no veto power over Hart's decisions.
Rutan vs. Funaki took place September 7, 1996 and was an awesome match.
Tributes. I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed tributes. Although I had read most of the obits when they were first published, it is nice to have them in book form. It's unfortunate we only get to see these in-depth bios when someone dies. Being a wrestling fan since I was a kid in the late 50s, I would love to see a volume 2 with bios on wrestlers who are still around like Fred Blassie, Killer Kowalski, and Johnny Valentine, and wrestlers who passed away years ago like Haystacks Calhoun, Argentina Rocca, and Vittorio Apollo. One other thing I'd like to mention. The only thing that bothers me about the Observer is when you always quote Phil Mushnick of the New York Post.
I must admit that I don't read his column, but it sounds to me the man is obsessed with hating wrestling, and nothing will change his mind.
He probably needs to get a life. I don't think most wrestling fans care what he has to say, and you give him importance by quoting him. Second, being a journalist, you must know that the New York Post has about as much credibility as the National Enquirer and is a laughingstock among many New Yorkers. True story. The Post once asked Bloomingdale's why they won't advertise in the paper, and they said, "Your readers are our shoplifters. So please, no more Mushnick." Steve Dworkin. Little Neck, New York. Response from Dave Meltzer.
I probably deal with more journalists than anyone in this industry, with the possible exception of Jay Andronako and Alan Sharp.
When it comes to being street smart and understanding this industry, I'd rate Mushnick behind only Alex Merves among mainstream reporters.
I think the problem a lot of people have with him is that they realize he understands the business too well, and I don't mean the insignificant aspects of it or the details of this week's angles, but the big picture, and his points, usually negative, are often inarguably valid. That's why people who have a problem with him usually don't debate the merits of his points but try to ignore the points themselves and criticize him personally. He's clearly done the industry more good in the big picture than any mainstream journalist. Those who disagree, please answer this question.
Granted, it's all fallen by the wayside, but would there have ever been steroid testing in the first place in this industry without Mushnick?
And how many kids are being molested this week around wrestling as compared with years ago?
Compare the number of drug deaths among active pro wrestlers over the last decade with that of active NBA or Major League Baseball or football players to debate the merits of his bringing that subject up. And while you're at it, please defend the current product being marketed so strongly to kindergarten-aged kids and disagree with Mushnick's stance. As for the Post reference, he's also the sports columnist for TV Guide, the best-selling magazine in the country.
I've dealt with many of the leading reporters in the New York area, and while the Post doesn't have major credibility, Mushnick is highly respected by his peers, to the point Village Voice a few years ago called him the best sports columnist in the New York market, and his coverage of pro wrestling was listed as one of the leading reasons.
I've dealt with enough reporters in newspapers that have respect, who don't have a clue about the subject and have written articles on the profession that have no clue, so when a reporter who has a clue has something to say, whether positive or negative, I take it seriously, and far more often than not.
Mushnick is right on the money.
Super Astros. I've got some comments on the WWF Super Astros program.
While it is great to see wrestling in Spanish, being that I'm Puerto Rican, and getting to see more of the Latino wrestlers on a weekly basis because Univision is the only Hispanic channel in the Washington, D.C. market, the show is way too short.
The quality is good, but the matches are too short.
I'm not asking for 15 to 20-minute matches, but 1 and 3-minute matches don't cut it.
Why is Super Astros only 30 minutes?
Raw is 2 hours and all the other WWF programming is 1 hour, so why do us Latinos only get 30 minutes? Why is it that Miguel Perez gets props on Super Astros but never did on Raw?
I don't think it's fair since he's bilingual and talented and now can't appear on Raw. I shouldn't complain because when Perez was booked on Raw, all he did was job.
One thing on the show that's getting old quickly is Mini Max flirting with Maria Felipe.
It was cute at first, but it's gotten boring. Wilson Rivera II. Washington, D.C. Graham. Just a few comments about the death of superstar Billy Graham that people still believe is true in the Philadelphia area. In the late 1970s, there was a Philadelphia area newspaper called the Philadelphia Journal. It was a small paper very different than the other two. It was in this paper that Gorilla Monsoon had his weekly article. This paper didn't last a long time. While I don't recall the obituary about Graham, I do recall he used to answer fan questions in his article. We wrote him once after seeing Antonio Inoki with a WWF title belt in a newsstand magazine under the heading "The Match the WWF Doesn't Want You to Know About." Needless to say, Gorilla didn't address our question.
In the late 70s, the WWF house shows at the Spectrum were shown live on Prism Cable.
The Spectrum was owned by the Snyder family, the same family that owned the Philadelphia Flyers. Every month on Prism you could see the major WWF house show live. This was later changed to a one-day delay broadcast, and eventually stopped altogether when Vince Jr. took over the company.
The Philadelphia shows in those days were promoted by Phil Zacco and the announcers were Dick Graham and Cal Rudman.
It was during one of those shows in which they announced Graham had died in Arizona from cancer. It was a very detailed obituary.
When the WWF later brought back Billy Graham with a bald head doing the martial arts gimmick against Bob Backlund, it was a big hit in New York, but it died in Philadelphia. Whenever you meet a person who admits to being a longtime Philadelphia wrestling fan who reminisces about the old WWF,
They are quick to recall the WWF passing off a fake Billy Graham. I do have a question that maybe you can deal with. How did the promoters deal with the newsstand magazines who ran stories that were contrary to what the promoters wanted fans to know? A good example would be the Backlund and Noki fiasco, in which the WWF didn't release the story but some magazines did. In retrospect, it looked like the magazines and the promoters were working together to get stories over. Name unable to read. Response from Dave Meltzer: in the 70s there was very little communication in wrestling, but by the 80s it had grown. The so-called misnamed After mags, After was a part of the Stan Weston group of wrestling mags dating back to the early 70s, pretty much ran their own sensationalized storylines, usually wilder and more ahead of the times than the promotions themselves were running, with a healthy dose of clothes-ripping women's apartment house wrestling in the back of the book. See, it told you they were actually ahead of the times. By the 80s, as wrestling grew in popularity, they upped the standard and were covering things straighter, and there was far more communication by that point. At times, both for those mags, and for others, if magazines printed something the promotions didn't like, the promotions would threaten the magazine's press credentials and right to shoot close-up photos, which were really the lifeblood of the newsstand mags. McMahon actually banned all the mags for what seemed like close to 10 years from shooting at WWF events. Unofficially the favored mags, after a few years of both sides playing games, weren't hassled about shooting with long lenses not from ringside, as one of his early goals was to own the entire business for himself, control everything, and not only was he attempting to put the other promoters out of business, but once he created his own magazine, the other wrestling magazines as well. One famous incident in the mid-80s, when the WWF and the After mags were at war and thus they were in bed with Jim Crockett, who took advantage of the situation to increase his national pub through those mags and even put After on his TV shows as a regular, saw Dusty Rhodes, with his popularity waning and actually getting booed heavily in many arenas because his heel rival was a popular Ric Flair, insist on winning the Most Popular Wrestler award. At the time that was ridiculous, being that Roddy Piper had just turned and it was at Hogan's peak. But the After mags were threatened with revocation of their press credentials if they didn't cater to Dusty, and Dusty did win, with them creatively trying to explain how the popularity of Hogan and Piper saw them split the WWF votes, allowing Dusty to win. UFC, thanks for printing my letter and your comments. The standard of competition faced by Royce Gracie, Dan Severn, Don Frye and Mark Coleman was relative for the time. Yes, the standard is higher today because the aforementioned fighters each took the sport up a level and started cross-training. By full NHB rules, I mean matches with no biting and no eye gouging. Full VALE TUDO rules. I fully understand and agree with the need for both time limits and judges' decisions. I didn't suggest otherwise. Frank Shamrock's winning streak pales in comparison with Boss Rutan's in PANCRASE against the best technical fighters in the world. Shamrock beat Dan Henderson in Contenders and Tsuyoshi Kosaka in Rings. I don't see how this has any relevance to UFC, as the rules are completely different, and I wouldn't consider Henderson or Kosaka's achievements in MMA anything to write home about. They have won all their UFC matches via judges' decisions. While you are critical of Brazilians sitting on their back, how does it differ from fighters in the UFC that sit on their back and rack up points, occasionally going for submissions, or fighters that wait for stand-ups to rack up their points, or ground and pound merchants? I can only recall one fighter in Pride who sat on his back and did nothing: Hugo Duarte. It seems that training in Lion's Den or the Alliance for a few months makes you a great fighter. That's what I mean by manufactured martial artists. The Brazilians you mentioned have manufactured reputations but are not manufactured martial artists. They have been training in their art for their entire life. I criticize UFC's rule changes because, other than Viewers' Choice Canada, not one major pay-per-view carrier has took them back on board. So what is the point? It just seems to alienate fighters and results in more fights going the distance. In Pride 4, 2 of 8 fights went the distance. In UFC Brazil, 2 of 6 did. If you compare the past 4 events for both, UFC has more fights going the distance, so your criticism of fighters hanging on for a draw in Pride is irrelevant. If Pride opted for judges' decisions after draws, half the fighters wouldn't set foot in the ring. Armedi. Middlesbrough, England. Response from Dave Meltzer. Full NHB rules limited to no biting and eye gouging doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Even in Brazil, you can't kick with any footwear. Shamrock's winning streak isn't as long as Rutan's, but the quality of competition Rutan beat, well, basically all real fighters and nobody that could be called a joke, including some excellent fighters including Shamrock himself, Guy Mesger and Masakatsu Funaki, still isn't at the level of the people Shamrock beat as far as their accomplishments within MMA. Based on his being unbeaten actually for almost 4 years going into UFC, Rutan is very much a proven commodity as a fighter, and having so many fights in a row without a loss is exceedingly impressive. But if you don't consider Shamrock's win over Kosuke relevant because the rules were different, then none of Ruden's wins are relevant because they were all fought under the same rules as the Shamrock-Kosuke match. Henderson won a tournament with very fast submission wins in Brazil, and won the toughest middleweight tournament in recent MMA history in UFC, squeaking out wins in 2 very tough fights against very good fighters, and has never lost an MMA match. Kosuke is exceedingly well respected by almost all insiders, and to this point I only know of 2 shoot matches he's lost in recent years, and he's done a lot of shoots, one to Shamrock, which was on points, and another to Kiyoshi Tamura by submission. There is a huge difference between sitting on your back engaging in combat looking for submissions and reversals, and laying on your back while the opponent is standing or doing so to stall for the time limit to expire. While 25% of the last Pride fights went the distance as compared to 33% in UFC Brazil, UFC had nobody stalling for a draw because doing so would mean a loss. Pride did in 2 fights. In Duarte's case he didn't accomplish his goal, and the matchmaking in Pride on paper was more lopsided. Realistically, Takada vs. Hickson was, at least from a booking standpoint, a total mismatch, even though it turned out more competitive and was a good fight. Sano vs. Honma was a pathetic mismatch. Otsuka vs. Ruiz was booked as one but shocked everyone when it turned out Ruiz ran out of gas due to an illness and couldn't fight, and many thought since Duarte was destroyed by Abbott, albeit using tactics that John McCarthy said in the rules meeting were illegal, although according to the rule book they were legal, in seconds. His facing Kerr, far superior to Abbott, was also a mismatch and pretty much turned into a very long mismatch. In UFC Brazil, not one fight was booked on paper as a mismatch going in, even though Belfort blew by Silva, Shamrock hammered Lebay, and an out-of-condition Abbott was hammered in a match that he was actually booked to win. So of course with more evenly booked matches you'll have matches that go the distance. With the exception of Rickson Gracie, whose greatest skill as a fighter is his business acumen, and believe me, that's not a knock. In Pride wouldn't have stepped in the ring if they had judges. Kerr, Duarte, Ruiz, Sakuraba, Goes, Ismail and Goodridge, all done so many times either in UFC or other competition. This is the end of this program. See you next time.